Right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Wednesday night session for 535 Intergovernmental Relations. I am still isolating at home. I still have COVID. And so if you hear any dogs barking in the background, I apologize for that because I am teaching from home tonight. I should have a pretty good, stable internet connection. But if for some reason I disappear, it just means that my internet's acting up and then I'll log right back in again. So if I disappear, don't go anywhere. The session will remain open and I'll be right back as soon as I can. But there are some challenges, obviously, anytime you teach from home. So we're going to deal with those challenges if they do pop up this evening. But welcome, everyone. I know we've got some more folks who will be joining us. I also know there are some people who won't be able to be with us tonight, but we are recording the session. Let me double check and make sure. Yeah, we are recording the session. So as always, what I will do is that you're familiar with the way in which we handle this. The recording I will have up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning, so you can always go and review the recording at any time throughout the week that you would like to. So, a couple announcements before we get started tonight with some of our preliminary information. First announcement is just a reminder, if you have not signed up to lead a discussion of an article yet, please do that as soon as possible. Send me an email with your top choices and I'll try and accommodate your requests. Most of the articles have already been chosen. So if you go into our Canvas site under that announcement that says article sign up, you'll see the most recent version of our spreadsheet. I believe there are maybe 6 or 7 articles that have not yet been spoken for. So if you haven't signed up yet, take a look at what articles remain and then feel free to send me an email. We'll get you signed up for an article to lead a discussion on. That's for your discussion leader assignment. For your article critiques, again, I don't need to know what articles you're going to critique. That's completely up to you. We can have multiple people writing critiques on the same articles. It's just we can't have multiple people discussing the same article in class in the discussion leader. So you can do whatever articles you'd like. All the articles within the O'Toole textbook are fair game. The articles that I have included on our Canvas site, those articles are fair game as well. But you'll be doing 2 of those article critiques. The little hitch here, I guess, is that there aren't exactly due dates for the article critiques, but the article critique must be submitted before we discuss that article in class. So, for instance, if you would like to write a critique on one of the articles we're going to be discussing next week, the Grodzins article, the Wright article, the Derthick article, or Federalist Paper number 10 or Federalist Paper number 39, if you want to write a critique on any of those 5 readings, you would have to then turn that critique in before class begins next Wednesday, because I really want to see your thought process and really want to see your critique of the article before we actually talk about it and discuss it as a class. So just keep an eye on that outline and make sure that you're getting those critiques in before we discuss them in class. Then your discussion board assignments, I've already seen that maybe 3 or 4 people have already submitted their discussion board assignments, so thank you for that. But the discussion board assignment number 1 is due by December 12th, which is next Tuesday by midnight. And that's the schedule we're going to follow, is that the discussion board assignments will be due the day before we meet again as a class. So those are due next Tuesday. And for that one, it's a pretty straightforward type of a discussion. You just base upon your reading of the Constitution, and we will talk. We will talk about the Constitution tonight. Let me mute that. Okay. We'll talk about the Constitution tonight, but based upon your understanding of the Constitution for this discussion board post, you'll just give me a really brief indication of which level of government you feel is dominant or should be dominant based upon the Constitution. Your post should be relatively parsimonious. We've been through this before. You've had me in class before. So we're looking at, 2, 3, 4, something like that paragraph. So a very parsimonious, concise response to my prompt. And then as always, you'll then be responding to 2 of your classmates, and each of those responses can be very parsimonious, looking at maybe a paragraph for each one of those responses. So every week, you'll be giving me 3 posts, 1 response to my initial prompt, and then responses to 2 of your classmates. And I think that's it for all of my housekeeping issues. You've had a chance to look at the syllabus. We talked about the syllabus on Saturday. Do you have any questions at all about the course or course requirements? Okay. If any questions emerge along the way, feel free, as always, to send me an email. I'm happy to clarify or answer any questions that you may have. For tonight, my primary goal is to work our way through some of these foundational issues for intergovernmental relations and federalism. So tonight we're going to talk about some key terms that we really need to have a good handle on to understand intergovernmental relations. We're then also going to talk about some of the different roles and responsibilities of national, state, and local governments. We're going to talk about the development of American federalism, how it got embodied into our Constitution, and the way in which the Constitution discusses issues of federalism. We'll also then talk about the evolution and development of federalism, and I'll take you through the different eras of federalism and how our approach to balancing power between the different levels of government really has changed over the past 200 years. And we'll start in the late 1780s and we'll work our way up to the current point in time. Then I'll also share with you some interpretations of federalism by the Supreme Court. We'll talk about how the Supreme Court's interpretation of the balance of power between national, state, and local governments really has shifted and how it has changed over the past 200 plus years. And then we'll wrap everything up tonight by going through the Constitution, primarily with an eye upon what different elements of the Constitution tell us about the balance of power between national and state governments. And I think that's probably a pretty good, pretty full agenda. Like I said, I'm still dealing with COVID, as you can probably tell from my voice. My voice is much better than it was on Saturday, but we'll see how long I can go and hopefully at least get through all of that information tonight to then set the stage for next week when we'll really start getting into some of those readings that we have assigned for the course. Okay. So at the very basic level, I think a good place to start is to develop a definition of some key terms that are important for the understanding of federalism and intergovernmental relations. And one of the first and most important things to understand is the difference between constitutional federalism and intergovernmental relations. Now, I'm an old guy, obviously, and so when I was in grad school and I took my class on this topic, the course was called federalism. And most courses like that were called federalism back in the day. Now, federalism courses have now become intergovernmental relations courses. And you're kind of hard pressed to find a course in an MPA or an MA program in political science on federalism unless you're at Harvard or I think maybe Georgetown may have one. But for the most part, most of these courses tend to be intergovernmental relations. And that's because when we are talking about constitutional federalism, we are talking about the relationship between two levels of government, the relationship between the national government and state governments as embodied in the US Constitution. That's what we refer to as constitutional federalism. So when we talk about constitutional federalism, that's not really a role to play for local governments because local governments have no protections that are not spoken of in the federal constitution. However, we know today that whenever we're looking at the relationship between different levels of government, local governments factor in very prominently, and local governments are very important players in this relationship. And so once we include local governments into our discussion, we have then moved from a discussion of constitutional federalism to a discussion of intergovernmental relations. And that's why most courses today are called intergovernmental relations, because we do place a focus upon the roles and responsibilities of local governments. I know the vast majority of people in the cohort, if you work in the public sector, vast majority of you are working at the local government level. And so our focus in this course primarily will be on intergovernmental relations, including local governments in that three-way type of relationship. Now, once we include local governments into our discussion, we start talking about intergovernmental relations. We have to recognize that the autonomy of a local government from a constitutional perspective is much different than the autonomy and sovereignty of a state government. In the US Constitution, we have this provision built, or several provisions built into the Constitution providing for sovereignty and providing for autonomy of state governments. So whenever state governments have a conflict with the national government and want to push back on national influence, they can do that by going to the US Constitution. Local governments do not have that same opportunity. The only powers and protections that local governments have in our system of American federalism come to them from state constitutions and state laws and laws that have been passed by the voters in that state, because they have no constitutional standing at the national constitution. That is an idea that's come to be known as Dillon's Rule. And there was this very now famous Supreme Court justice in the state of Iowa named, I believe his name was Fletcher Dillon. Oh, I'm sorry, Forrest Dillon, I believe his name was. And Justice Dillon, during his service on the Iowa State Supreme Court, promulgated this thing known as Dillon's Rule that says local governments are creatures of the state. Local governments are created by state governments. They are empowered by state governments. They are controlled by state governments. And if deemed necessary, they can then be destroyed by state governments. They can then be taken out of existence. You're probably familiar with things such as home rule protections. And some local governments have these home rule protections, whereby they are given more flexibility in terms of budgeting and more flexibility in terms of holding their elections and deciding what type of government they want to have. If they want to be a reform government and you have city manager, if they want to be a strong mayor, if they want to be a weak mayor form of government, those determinations can be made by those local governments if they have those home rule protections. State governments will spell out in the state constitution the requirements for applying to be a home rule government, or as we refer to them here in California, being a charter government. If you are a charter government, your charter is essentially the constitution, if you will, that you put together at the local level. And you can, again, as a charter government, you can have more determination in terms of budgeting and form of government and elections. And you can achieve that charter designation and get those home rule protections under the Constitution if you meet certain population density requirements. And there are some requirements that are spelled out in the Constitution whereby you can become a charter government. But all those decisions are made by the state government and embodied in either state law or in the state constitution. We have seen some instances here in the state of California where the state legislature has talked very seriously about removing incorporation status from some local governments. Vernon is an example. The state legislature is looking very closely at Vernon because, as you know, Vernon tends to be a very commercially dense, industrial dense type of community. You don't have a whole lot of residents per square mile in Vernon. It's primarily commerce and industry. And so there have been some movements in the state legislature to unincorporate, if you will, Vernon and take away its city status. And we've had some conversations like that as well for Yoruba Valley in the past. And so the state does have the ability not only to create and empower local governments, but also to destroy those local governments and take them out of existence. So the sovereignty of a state government is much different than the sovereignty of a local government under our system of American federalism. And that's a really important concept to keep in mind as we read these articles and as we consider the quote unquote proper roles and responsibilities of the three different levels of government. Another very important term in federalism is what's known as the correspondence principle. The correspondence principle will argue that those governments that are most impacted by a decision should also be the governments that are most involved in making that decision. So if you have a decision that's being made in Washington, D.C., that will have profound impacts upon the city of Long Beach, correspondence principle says that the mayor of Long Beach and your city manager and all of your city council members, those individuals should be given a seat at the negotiating table in making those decisions, that the impact should correspond with the ability to participate in decision making. This idea of correspondence principle really lends itself to one of the three terms in federalism that all start with D, and that term is decentralization. This is really all about decentralization. Decentralization is decentralizing decision making to allow affected governments a seat at the decision making table. And that's what the correspondence principle is all about. So, whenever we have these mandates that are handed down from Washington, D.C., that have profound impacts on local governments, if local governments are not asked about these mandates, if they're not allowed to participate in the development of these mandates, then we are obviously violating this correspondence principle. And unfortunately, in our system of American federalism and intergovernmental relations, we routinely violate this correspondence principle. If you work at the local level of government, you probably have seen many instances where this correspondence principle is being violated. And also, this correspondence principle just does not just apply to local national relations, but also local state relations as well. And if you work at the local level, you're probably painfully familiar with a lot of the state mandates that the state of California hands down to local governments, and oftentimes without any local government participation. That, again, is a violation of this correspondence principle. But it's one thing to allow these affected governments to have a seat at the decision-making table. That's decentralization. It's another issue to then provide them with the resources to carry out the decisions that they are making. Providing state and local governments with the resources necessary to effectively implement the decisions that they are making, that is a federalism principle known as subsidiarity. That last bullet point you see on the screen, subsidiarity. Kind of a strange word, but subsidiarity speaks to the second D of federalism, which is devolution. So once you allow government a seat at the decision-making table and then they render their decisions, the question then is, do they then have the resources to carry out those decisions? Subsidiarity says that if a national government is asking a state or a local government to take an action, it is incumbent upon the national government to provide the adequate resources for state and local governments to take that action. Essentially, as you are all very familiar with in our system of federalism, when we violate subsidiarity, we usually violate it through the use of unfunded or partially funded mandates. Congress loves to pass unfunded and partially funded mandates, telling state and local governments to do things without giving them the resources to actually carry those things out. So when we violate correspondence, we're violating decentralization. When we're violating subsidiarity, we are violating the principle of devolution. As we go through our discussion in this class and through our multiple articles, we are going to see instance after instance where the federal government violates the correspondence and subsidiarity principle in dealing with state and local governments. And also, we will see state governments and how they violate the correspondence and subsidiarity principles when they deal with their local governments. Just because state governments rail against unfunded and partially funded federal mandates, it does not stop state governments from imposing similar types of unfunded and partially funded mandates upon their local governments. So just keep those terms in your mind for a while, because we're going to, as we go through our articles, return to those terms and provide some examples of how we sometimes violate these principles of federalism. It's also important to remember that, in this class, we are focusing on American federalism, American intergovernmental relations, but we are not the only federal system in the world. There are a lot of other systems of government that are federal as well, that have multiple levels of government. Australia has a vibrant system of federalism. Nigeria has a vibrant system of federalism. But our system of federalism tends to be relatively unique. And it tends to be relatively unique because of the inherent sovereignty of state governments and the idea that it was the state governments that joined together to create this union. And so the states predated the national government. And by predating the national government, there's some inherent deference to the sovereignty of state governments that we have embodied within our system of American federalism. So how do we know what the relationship between our different levels of government should be in our federal system? Well, obviously, that's going to come to us from our social contract. And you're all very familiar with social contract theory. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, where he postulated this idea that people enter into a social contract with their government. And just like any other contract, it spells out what both parties need to do. So in a social contract, the people who retain power, and the power comes from the people, they decide what power to give up to government. And then in exchange, government then promises to use these powers in a judicious manner to provide for the well-being of society. And so that's this contractual relationship between people and their government. And it was Thomas Jefferson, actually, he was using some of the writings of Rousseau, but it was Thomas Jefferson who actually talked about not only is it the right of people to replace their government if the government's violating the social contract, but indeed it is incumbent upon people to replace their government if that government violates that social contract. So our entire system of governance is based upon social contract theory, and obviously our social contract is the Constitution. As you know from your readings this week, I provide for the Articles of Confederation as well as the Constitution on our Canvas site. If you had a chance to look through the Articles of Confederation, you know the Articles of Confederation served as our first Constitution. Articles of Confederation, this first Constitution, had many flaws associated with them. They created a very weak national government. If you look at the national government that was created under the Articles of Confederation, you essentially had a unibranch government in that you had this Congress of the states. So we had kind of this legislative body that was a meeting of the states, a Congress of the states, and that's kind of where all the power resided. We really did not have an independent executive. We didn't have independent judiciary. The power resided in this Congress, this meeting of the states. But it's not the type of Congress that we're familiar with today. We think about Congress today, we think about Capitol Hill, and we think about these permanent structures that we go to bed tonight, we're going to wake up tomorrow morning, and for good or bad, Congress is still going to be there. Under the Articles of Confederation, that was not the way the term Congress was used. Congress in the Articles was used to refer to a meeting. So a Congress is a meeting. Tonight, we are having a Congress of PPA 535 intergovernmental relations. We're having a meeting of 535. That's the term that they use in the Articles of Confederation. So in essence, the United States was the United States when you had Congress in session, when you had all these states sending delegates to meet in this meeting of the states in this Congress. And that's where the power came from, was in this meeting. That meeting is a temporary meeting. They're not in that meeting permanently. That's for a temporary period of time. Also, when the states sent their delegates to this Congress, to this meeting, they could also recall their delegates at any time that they wanted. So if a state didn't like what was going on in this Congress, in this meeting, they could simply recall their delegates and bring their delegates home. I think one of the best ways to underscore the weakness of the national government under the Articles of Confederation is to think about how often the term United States of America was used as a proper noun. And if you've read through the Articles of Confederation, you probably noticed that United States of America, capitalized and as a proper noun, that term was used one time. And it was used when the articles say, the style of this confederacy, this confederation shall be the United States of America. And by style, they mean essentially the name. They're saying the name of this union will be the United States of America. After that, throughout the rest of the articles, whenever we refer to the United States, we refer to the United States in Congress assembled. So the United States, only the United States, when the states were meeting in this Congress, in Congress assembled. So there wasn't really any true national identity that was provided to us from this article, from these Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation did not create a standing army or a standing navy for us. There was difficulty in terms of regulating commerce because different states were using different currency and different coinage. If you've got different states using different currency, it's going to make interstate commerce next to impossible to regulate and to engage in. And another problem with the Articles of Confederation is even if we recognize that there are these fatal flaws in the Articles, the only way to amend the Articles was with a unanimous vote of all 13 states. So all 13 states had to agree before we could amend the Articles of Confederation. So you've got all these problems inherent within the articles, and then a recognition that you really can't fix those problems because you got to have a unanimous vote. And you know how difficult it is to get a unanimous vote on anything, especially a unanimous vote between these 13 separate states. So there's kind of this undercurrent going on of concern about the articles, concern about the lack of national defense under the articles, and the inability of the articles to regulate really any aspect of commerce. In the articles were truly a confederation. And the difference between a confederation and a federation is in a confederation, the states remain sovereign. So the states retain their own sovereignty under this confederation. Well, you're probably familiar with, you took the policy class, and so you're probably familiar with the way in which policies get made in this country. And the way in which we have policies made in this country, they tend to be made using Kingdon's policy window type of an approach, if you learn that in your 670 course, or what some people call the punctuated equilibrium model of policy making. Anthony Downs calls it the issue attention cycle. But all of these different theories basically say that in order to have a major change made to a policy, something needs to occur. There needs to be some type of a triggering event that occurs that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change and we need to fundamentally change the way in which we're approaching this policy issue. That again, John Kingdon tells us that, and again, you get that from all these policy theorists. So for the Articles of Confederation, one of the primary triggering events was this thing known as Shays' Rebellion. And I don't know if anyone remembers Shays' Rebellion from your history classes, but anybody familiar with Shays' Rebellion and what happened in Shays' Rebellion? It's kind of a reach because I'm kind of asking you to reach back to your undergraduate history. Shays' Rebellion, actually, the name of it probably gives way too much credit to Daniel Shays, who was a retired Army captain. And he was one of the leaders of Shays' Rebellion, but actually there were rebellions that were going on in a variety of different areas, especially within the state of Massachusetts. Shays was leading one of those rebellions, but he was not the only leader of the rebellion. But, you know, people have to put a name to it. And so because the rebellion he led was the largest rebellion, it ends up being called Shays' Rebellion. But the idea behind Shays' Rebellion is that you had farmers who were losing their farms. You have farmers who owed money. And those loans are being called in and being called in very aggressively. And so the farmers did not have the ability to repay their loans. And so their farms started to be foreclosed upon. Well, the farmers wanted to revolt, obviously, because they wanted to keep their farms. And then, led by several individuals, including this retired Army Captain Daniel Shays, they rebelled against a variety of different institutions in the state of Massachusetts. The rebellion that was led by Daniel Shays was a rebellion against the Springfield Armory. And it took a while to put the rebellion down, which really galvanized public opinion around the idea that the articles probably are not providing for us a strong enough national defense. Because if we had so much difficulty putting down a rebellion led by a retired Army captain and a bunch of farmers, what are we going to do if we are invaded again by a foreign country? How are we going to protect ourselves? We don't have that type of protection embodied within the Articles of Confederation. So even though the rebellions were put down, it still really raised a lot of concern about maybe we need to amend the articles to create a stronger national defense and create more national protection. But now remember, in order to amend the articles, you had to have the agreement of all 13 states. So the easiest way to get unanimous agreement was to have a constitutional convention. So we have this constitutional convention, and the purpose of the constitutional convention was merely to amend the articles. That was the entire extent of the purpose of the constitutional convention. The convention was not intended to replace the articles with a new constitution, merely to just correct some of the flaws in the articles. At this constitutional convention, we had a situation where we had a lot of conflicts between the delegates. One of the major conflicts between the delegates was this conflict between our small states and our large states, our less populated states and our more populated states. So states like New Jersey versus states like New York or Virginia. And the big controversy between large and small states was about representation. So how would we dole out the seats, if you will, in terms of representation in the national legislative body, in this Congress? Large states obviously wanted proportional representation because that would provide them more seats and more representation in Congress. Small states obviously wanted equal representation, an equal number of representatives from each state. The large state plan calling for proportional representation was known as the Virginia Plan. The small state plan calling for equal representation was known as the New Jersey Plan. And then we ended up coming up, or the delegates ended up coming up with what they called the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. And in the Connecticut Compromise, they created a bicameral legislature. So we'll create a House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will then have representatives based upon proportional representation. So larger states will have more seats in the House of Representatives than smaller states. And then we'll create a second House of Congress known as the Senate, and the Senate will then have equal representation, regardless of the population of the state. So that Connecticut Compromise is the way in which the delegates mitigated this conflict between large and small states on the topic of representation. The second conflict was one that was much more difficult to deal with, and one that admittedly the framers did not deal with well. And that was this conflict between slave and non-slave states. Obviously, slave states wanted to incorporate slavery as an institution within the Constitution. They wanted the Constitution to speak specifically about the institution of slavery and protections provided to continue this institution moving forward in not only the future, but also expanding it out west into the Western territories. Many at the Constitutional Convention from non-slave states pushed back on this idea, and they did not want slavery as an institution incorporated within the Constitution. So the way in which the delegates came to a compromise, if you will, and again, it was a horrendous compromise, but the way in which they came for the compromise, first, the three-fifths compromise in terms of representation, which is incorporated within Article 1 of the Constitution, or was incorporated within Article 1 of the Constitution, since obviously been rendered moot because of the 14th Amendment, but saying that essentially slaves would count as three-fifths of a free person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. And then the second way in which they dealt with it was by prohibiting any laws that would ban the slave trade until at least the year 1808. So the framers essentially took this issue of the slave trade and they punted it to a future generation. Clearly, both the three-fifths compromise as well as the prohibition against banning the slave trade until 1808, those two provisions obviously hastened us toward the Civil War and really laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a very bloody conflict in the Civil War, which I think it was something like over 500,000 Americans lost their lives because of that Civil War. So admittedly, the compromise, again, I use that term very loosely, but the compromise the framers came to try and mitigate this conflict between slave and non-slave states, obviously, in a word, is essentially horrendous compromises. And we've paid the price ever since. Your third conflict, and the one that is very important, obviously, for what we discuss here in this class, was a conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists wanted to see a stronger national government and wanted to replace the Articles of Confederation with a brand new constitution. Anti-Federalists believed in states' rights and state sovereignty. They liked the sovereignty that the Articles provided to individual states. They did recognize that the Articles did not create enough national defense in order to provide security to the states. So they did want some changes to the Articles, but they did not want to replace the Articles with a new constitution. The way in which this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists ended up getting resolved had a lot to do with timing. Timing in life is pretty much almost everything. And so when you think about the Constitutional Convention, it was not easy to get to the convention. You had muddy roads, you had a lot of rains that made it difficult to traverse these roads. And so some delegates made it to the convention quicker and earlier than other delegates. The Federalists were the ones who, for the most part, made it to the Constitutional Convention before the Anti-Federalists. And so people like Alexander Hamilton, people like at that time James Madison. And so those Federalists who are arguing for replacing the Articles with a new constitution that would create a stronger national government, since they were there first, they really started to get the ball rolling toward the idea of removing the Articles, replacing them with this brand new constitution. Madison especially was very successful at convincing the Anti-Federalists that they wanted more out of this Constitution than just national defense. Anti-Federalists were very happy to say, yes, we need stronger national defense. We saw what happened in Shays' Rebellion. They were very happy to make that concession. But Madison knew he had to get them to admit they wanted more. And what he got them to admit is that they wanted to get their debts repaid. If you think about the delegates, the vast majority of delegates at the Constitutional Convention, give me a demographic profile of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. Who were they? What did they look like? And you can use text chat, you can use your microphone, whatever you're comfortable using.
Were they all men, white men?
Yep, you're right, Kim. They were all white males. And not only were they all white males, they were also property owners. So you had to be a white male and you had to be a property owner. As a property owner, these delegates were the creditors. These were the people who loaned money to make the Revolutionary War and independence possible. Many of these people had not gotten their debts repaid. And Madison knew that, and he knew that was a nerve that he could push on these Anti-Federalists. And if he could get the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted a national government that was empowered to regulate commerce and regulate the economy in order to get these debts repaid, essentially it was game over. And once the Anti-Federalists admitted that, then the Articles were dead. And we knew that the new Constitution would replace those Articles with the creation of a much stronger national government that not only provided for national defense, but also had elements in it that could regulate commerce. If you think about Article 1, Section 8, so one of the major powers of Congress is to regulate interstate commerce. Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress can establish banks. Congress can coin money, coin currency. And so all those economic powers ended up getting built into this new Constitution under Article 1, Section 8. So what we end up seeing is that this new Constitution, when it emerges, is really just a series of compromises. Compromises between large and small states, compromises between slave and non-slave states, and for our purposes, most importantly, compromises between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So we get this new Constitution that's adopted at the Constitutional Convention, and the next hurdle is that the Constitution then has to be ratified by the states. According to Article 7 of the Constitution needed to be ratified by 9 out of 13 states. One complicating factor is that as the Constitution was going through the ratification process among state legislatures, we had a new state that joined the Union, and that new state was Vermont. So we ended up actually with 14 states, which then raised the bar up to a minimum of 10 out of 14 states that had to ratify the Constitution before it went into effect. As you can see, relatively quickly, you had 5 states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, that ratified the Constitution. The following year, you had 5 more states. You had Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Virginia. That's your 10 states. So you had 10 out of 14 states as of that point. And once you had that number of states, then the Constitution went into effect. However, the problem is you did not have the state of New York. New York was very much the linchpin of all commerce that was going on in the colonies. You think about where New York is located, the port of New York, much of the trade that was coming into the port of New York, then going across New York into the various states. If you did not have New York buying into this new Constitution, you weren't going to have a whole lot of trade and commerce going on. So the framers knew they had to convince the citizens of New York and the anti-federalists in New York to support this new Constitution. So, as you know from your history classes, 2 main things happened. One thing that happened is we immediately amended the Constitution 10 times with the Bill of Rights to provide certain protections to individuals and to states against too strong of a federal government. And so we had that Bill of Rights that was immediately incorporated. And then we also had the writing of the Federalist Papers, these 85 papers written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. John Jay only wrote 5 of the papers because he became ill pretty early on. I believe about 29 of the papers, I think, were written by Madison, but the vast bulk of the papers were written by Alexander Hamilton. And the purpose of the Federalist Papers was essentially to convince the anti-federalists and citizens of New York to support this new Constitution, to convince them not to be afraid of this new Constitution. This Constitution is something they're familiar with. A lot of the provisions in this Constitution are provisions that they currently have in their state constitutions. And it was, again, kind of a sales pitch that was being made to the citizens of New York. In terms of the Bill of Rights, we're very familiar that there are 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. However, there were 12 amendments that were initially proposed to become part of the Bill of Rights and be added to the Constitution. 2 of the amendments that did not get ratified by enough states. One of those amendments was written by James Madison. And that amendment said that Congress shall not vary their compensation. Congress cannot essentially give itself a raise until members of Congress sit for re-election. So there must be an intervening re-election before those members can then get that increase in pay. That was written by James Madison, again, way back in 1790. It did not get the number of states to ratify it that was necessary to add it to the Bill of Rights. Eventually, it would become part of the Constitution in the 27th Amendment. And I know it sounds weird, but in 1992, enough states ratified this amendment to make it the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, originally written by James Madison and then added to the Constitution over 200 years later. So that's one that didn't get into the original Bill of Rights. A second amendment that did not get added into the Bill of Rights, and it's supposed to be literally the Second Amendment, and that Second Amendment said they limited the size of congressional districts to no more than 50,000 residents. So it said a congressional House district can only have up to 50,000 citizens. It's probably a very good thing that the states did not ratify that amendment, because if that amendment had been ratified, the House of Representatives, instead of having 435 members, would have about 4,800 members if that would have been ratified. If you think it's hard enough to govern 435 members of the House, imagine trying to govern 4,800 members of the House of Representatives. So those 2 didn't make it in, but the other 10 made it into our Bill of Rights, again, to try and mollify the concerns of anti-federalists and especially the citizens in the state of New York. As we go through later in the class, go through the Constitution, we will go through those 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, and we'll talk about how those 10 amendments initially applied only to the national government, but over time have then been incorporated to include limitations against state governments as well. And I'll give you some examples of just how long it has taken to extend those protections from protections against the national government to protections against state governments. But as we look at the Constitution, what we will see is, again, there are competing provisions in this Constitution because it really is very much a series of compromises. So, for instance, when you look at the longest section of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 is by far the longest section and the most detailed section. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, we lay out the powers of this new Congress, this new bicameral Congress. In laying out the powers of this Congress, one of the things that the framers did is they engaged in what was called the enumeration of powers. Whenever you enumerate something, you are listing it. So we listed the Congress has the ability to raise an army and navy. Congress has the ability to declare war. Congress has the ability to coin money. Congress has the ability to establish post offices. Congress has the ability to, and so on and so on, regulate interstate commerce. So all those powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8 are enumerated powers. Why is that important? That is important because whenever you enumerate something, whenever you list something, you are by definition limiting the power of that body. So by saying, Congress, here are the specific powers that you have, the underlying assumption is that if a power is not listed in Article 1, Section 8, then that power does not belong to the Congress. That's the power, if you will, of enumerating, of actually listing these powers of Congress. So by enumeration, what the framers did is they were inherently limiting the power of Congress. But then you get to the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, with what's called the necessary and proper or the elastic clause that says Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution. Essentially, what that's saying is that Congress can do anything that it needs to do in order to execute these powers that have been given to it in Article 1, Section 8. So by enumerating powers, you're greatly limiting the power of the national government, very much limiting the power of Congress. By giving them this expansive elastic clause, you are basically giving them unbridled power and saying you can do anything that you determine is necessary and proper. So you can see how those two provisions certainly compete with each other. We'll see as we go through the Constitution later on in Article 6, the Constitution has this supremacy clause that says the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States, those are the supreme law of the land, meaning that when a state constitution comes into conflict with the national constitution wins. When a state law comes into conflict with the national law wins. That is a very strong pronouncement of national government power and creates a very strong national government. However, you then compare that supremacy clause to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. 10th Amendment to the Constitution is the Reserved Powers Amendment, which says that powers that have not been given to Congress nor denied to the states belong to the states and the people. So here we're saying if it's some of the power we haven't given to Congress or to the national government, then that power is going to be reserved for state governments. But yet the national government is supreme. So again, you've got these competing provisions because the Constitution is a series of compromises. Whenever you have all these compromises that create all these competing provisions in the Constitution, there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of room for interpretation. And so over the years, the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution has been the U.S. Supreme Court. And a little bit later on tonight, I'm going to take you through some examples of how the Supreme Court has interpreted this balance of power in the Constitution, sometimes in favor of the national government and at other times in favor of state governments. But one of the reasons why federalism is such a dynamic concept and why our opinion in terms of which level of government has the most power and should be dominant, those opinions change is because of the interpretation of these different competing provisions in this series of compromises that we know as the U.S. Constitution. But before we get into a discussion of the specific elements in the Constitution, the evolution of the constitutional federalism, I think we can at least kind of sketch out in very broad brushstrokes what are some of the powers that belong to the national government versus some of the powers that belong to state governments versus some of the powers that are reserved for local governments. So in terms of the national level, Some of the powers that belong to the national government are things such as Congress may coin money. And so only Congress can coin money. States are prohibited from coining money in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. So states cannot engage in that. That's something only for the national government. Treaty making. As we know, the way in which treaties are made, presidents enter into treaties. Those treaties are then subject to the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. When George Washington entered into his very first treaty, he assumed that the Senate would just literally be a rubber stamp. So much so that he actually took the treaty himself and hand delivered it to the Senate and then said he was going to wait outside. So he waited outside while the Senate would deliberate over this new treaty. And he waited outside for several hours until finally someone came out and said, well, Mr. President, it may take us another day or two to look at this treaty and come to a decision, which absolutely outraged George Washington because he felt it should just be a rubber stamp from the Senate. He was the president. If he entered into the treaty, that should be good enough. He stormed away and he never went back and visited Congress again. But the Senate does have this ability to provide their advice and consent on a treaty that's entered into by the president. Clearly, this is a role of the national government. And again, in Article 1, Section 10, states are actually precluded from entering into treaties and agreements, at least with foreign nations. A third power that belongs to the national government is the regulation of interstate commerce. And there's interstate commerce versus intrastate commerce. Interstate commerce is commerce that crosses state boundaries. Intrastate commerce is commerce that is contained within the boundaries of a state. So here we're talking about regulating interstate commerce, commerce that crosses state boundaries. Article 1, Section 8 provides that power exclusively to the Congress. Providing for an Army and Navy. Again, this is one of the primary concerns with the articles, is that we didn't have standing armies and navies. Well, here we provide Congress the ability to provide for a standing Army and Navy and to fund the Army and the Navy. Only Congress has the power to declare war. Presidents can certainly send military assets across the world into interventions, but when it actually comes to declaring war, that's something that can only be done by Congress. So the president must go to Congress before a joint session of Congress and ask for a declaration of war, much like what was done for World War I and also then done for World War II. There were several members of Congress who voted against a declaration of war in World War I. There was only one member of Congress who voted against a declaration of war in World War II, and that was a representative by the name of Jeanette Rankin. She had also voted against World War I, and she was the only person to vote against World War II. But Congress is the only one who has the ability to declare war. Issuing patents, that's something that's done at the national level. Only the national government's allowed to issue patents and trademarks. The admission of new states to the Union, that is another power that belongs only to Congress. A few years ago, we had this discussion going on in California. I think the discussion is also starting up again with New California, or whatever the proponents are calling it. But back a few years ago, there's a discussion about breaking California up into 3 separate states. That California is just too large to govern, and so we break it up into 3 different states. That's all well and good, and the voters were going to have the opportunity to vote on that. But that all doesn't mean anything unless Congress admits those new states into the Union, because only Congress has the ability to admit new states into the Union. And then obviously the ability to do whatever is necessary and proper in the Elastic Clause is again a power of Congress of the national level of government. Well, how about the power distribution for state governments? As we know, under Dillon's rule, state governments have the ability to create local governments. States have the ability to regulate trade within their state, to engage in regulation of intrastate commerce, not interstate, but intrastate commerce. States have the ability to conduct elections according to the Constitution. Now, this is subject to some limitations. In 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act put some limitations upon states in the way in which they conduct their elections. Any electoral maps that were developed by states that had a history of disenfranchising people discriminating against people in elections. Those maps would then have to get a pre-clearance from the national government before those maps could be considered. The Voting Rights Act also set up a system of federal election supervisors that could be sent into state and local governments to supervise and monitor elections. So there are some limitations that are placed upon the ability of states to conduct their elections. However, recently the Supreme Court has backed off on a lot of those limitations. We'll talk later on about a case like the Shelby versus Holder case, where the Supreme Court removed the pre-clearance requirement, removed the requirement for federal supervisors. And so a lot of those limitations on the state ability to conduct elections have really been removed in recent years by the US Supreme Court, which again underscores the way in which the US Supreme Court serves as the arbiter of the balance of power in our system of federalism. Ratification of amendments. We know that states have a role to play in the ratification of amendments. Typically, whenever an amendment is proposed, it is proposed by a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate, and then gets ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. The framers did that on purpose. They wanted a role for the states in the ratification of amendments to the Constitution. That's why we have that provision for state ratification. And reserve powers. We know that the 10th Amendment says that all powers are not given to the Congress nor prohibited to the states, belong to the states and the people. We reserve those powers then for state governments. But how many of those powers get reserved? Again, that is up to the interpretation, oftentimes, of the US Supreme Court. Well, what types of powers then tend to be shared? We have shared powers between the different levels of government, such as in taxation. So the federal government relies primarily upon the federal income tax. State governments rely upon both state income taxes, as well as for 45 out of the 50 states, a state sales tax as well. Local governments rely primarily on local option sales tax, as well as property taxes. But you'll notice what we try and do is we try and separate taxes and types of taxes used across the different levels of government. It's what's known as source separation. If we had all three levels of government relying only upon the income tax, then you're going to erode the ability of lower levels of government to generate revenue, because it's kind of like they'll cannibalize each other. So we have source separation where we try and have different levels of government relying upon different forms of taxation. The borrowing of money. All levels of government have the ability to borrow money. We are painfully familiar with that with Congress. Congress borrows a whole lot of money, and that's why we have such a large national debt. State governments borrow money as well. Local governments issue municipal debt, but they do so under limitations imposed upon them by the state as well as the national government. The creation of courts. The national government, Congress, created the federal judiciary. The only court that was created under Article 3 of the Constitution was the US Supreme Court. All other courts below the US Supreme Court were created by Congress. And currently in the federal judiciary, we have one Supreme Court, we have 13 different circuit courts of appeal, and we have 94 different district or trial courts. Those courts of appeal, those district trial courts, those are created by Congress. States create their own judicial system. And depending upon what state you're in, the judicial systems will look different. In the state of New York, all courts in the state of New York are referred to, all judges are referred to as justices. And the lowest level is what's referred to as a Supreme Court. It's kind of strange, but that's the way in which New York does it. So every state has their own system of jurisprudence, because they have the ability to create their own court systems. And spending for the general welfare. This is, again, a power that is shared by all levels of government. So as you can see, some of the powers belong to one level of government, some belong to another level of government, and there are still other powers that are shared between the different levels of government. It's in that sharing of powers is where we oftentimes have most of our discussions about, well, who has the responsibility? Which level of government should be responsible for this power versus this power, this responsibility? So that's kind of a basic overview of where American federalism came from. But one of the themes of that discussion is that federalism is dynamic. It is a changing concept that certainly changes over time. It is not static. And so the way in which federalism looked in the late 1700s is a lot different than the way in which federalism looks today. So let's walk through a discussion of the development and evolution of American federalism and the different eras or the different stages or phases of development that American federalism has gone through. Now, different federalism scholars will have different terms that they will use to describe each of these different eras. These are kind of the eras that I like to use and I think are most appropriate to describe the relationship between the different levels of government at these different points in time. The first era is what's known as dual federalism. And dual federalism runs basically from the 1780s up until the beginning of the Civil War. And one of the articles that we're going to read for next week, the author argues there really never was such a thing as dual federalism. But I won't talk much about that because that's an article that someone will be discussing next week. But in dual federalism, essentially what we have is we have this clear line of demarcation between what the national government does and what state governments do. So we've got the powers of the national government, we have the powers of the state government, and never the two shall meet. They are different spheres of power, different functions, different responsibilities, different areas of influence. In this period of dual federalism, the functions and responsibilities of state governments were much larger and more intensive than what the national government was doing. So state governments had most of the responsibility for the policies that affected the everyday lives of citizens, much more so than the national government. But as we move through the 1830s, 1840s, and the 1850s, we know the nation was being torn apart by the issue of slavery. And we knew the big question about slavery was as we were adding states from the Western territories, which of those states should be free versus which of those states should be slave states. And again, all this dates back to the way in which the framers didn't handle really the issue of slavery in the Constitution. So as we move through the 1840s and the 1850s, we had slave states in the South who felt that they were not having their interests represented in the Northern dominated Congress. And so whenever Congress would pass a law that these Southern states did not like, the Southern states would push back on those laws. And there were three mechanisms that they used to push back on these laws coming out of Congress. One strategy they use is what's known as, I'll put it in text chat, interposition. Interposition was when Southern states would say, we're going to use all the resources that we have at our disposal in order to stop or at least slow down the implementation of this law coming out of Congress. So they disagreed with the law, so they would just do everything they could to stop its implementation, kind of drag their feet in implementing this law. Interposition is a strategy we saw a lot of Southern states use in the 1840s and into the 1850s, but there's only so much you can slow down a law. There's only so much you can slow down implementation. So when interposition didn't work, they then moved to another more extreme measure, which was called nullification. And nullification is just what it sounds like. In nullification, if a Southern state disagreed with a law coming out of Congress, they would simply declare that law to be null and void. And they'll just ignore it. It's null and void. Congress doesn't have the authority to tell us what to do in this area. So therefore, we're just going to declare it null and void and just completely ignore the implementation of that law. So you can see that's a step beyond interposition. Obviously, when nullification did not work, that's when we get into the issue of secession. And that's where Southern states, beginning with South Carolina, decided, well, we will secede from the Union. We will leave this Union. Unfortunately, the philosophy that was used by John C. Calhoun and other secessionists was the philosophy that came out of James Madison, kind of unwittingly. One of the ways in which James Madison argued for the new Constitution is he made the argument to anti-federalists that don't fear this new national government because this new national government is created by the states. So it's the states who are sovereign, and they then decide, each of them individually then decide, yes, they are going to join this union. So therefore, if the states can join the union, then the extension of that is the states can then leave the union. And secessionists then use that as their legal argument for why it was legal and proper for Southern states to just decide to leave the union. So once we had secession, then obviously it brought us into the Civil War. Civil War, which raged on from 1861 to 1865. Once the Civil War was over and Congress moved into Reconstruction of the South, you then shift your eras of federalism from what's known as dual federalism into what a lot of authors refer to as competitive federalism. In competitive federalism, you have the national and state governments that are competing against each other for powers, duties, and responsibilities. So the basic model remains the same in that national government has its sphere of influence and states have their sphere of influence, and there's a line of demarcation between the two. The difference is that the national sphere begins to grow and the state sphere begins to shrink. The whole idea of states' rights that Southern states use in the lead up to the Civil War. Once the Civil War is over, those states no longer have that states' rights argument to use. It's impossible for them to say, well, we can leave the Union, because obviously they end up losing the Civil War and they were then reabsorbed back into the Union. So once the states' rights idea was dead, if the national government wanted to expand its duties and responsibilities, it would then do so at the detriment of state responsibilities and duties. It really became what we refer to as a zero-sum game. And you're probably familiar with game theory and zero-sum game as an example of game theory. In zero-sum game, there is a finite amount of power and authority out there in the world. So much so that if one party increases its power, by definition, it does so by reducing the power of another party. And so it's kind of this zero sum type of a game. And that's what we saw. So if you look at the mid like 1870s, 1880s into the 1890s, you saw the national government start to take over a lot of the responsibilities that up to that point in time were state responsibilities. So we saw the national government getting involved in regulating workplace safety. We saw the national government getting involved in regulating food safety and food quality. We saw the national government getting involved in regulating things such as the pharmaceutical drugs, the medicines, regulating transportation in terms of railroads, creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission to directly regulate commerce between the states. All of these things that used to be the responsibility of state governments have now been assumed by the national government. Hence the reason why it's referred to as competitive federalism. That period's going to run from the end of the Civil War up to the stock market crash and then the beginning of the New Deal. So we had the stock market crash in 1927. We then had the New Deal with the advent of the FDR administration in 1933. And when FDR comes in, he comes into this Great Depression. He knows that state governments and local governments do not have the resources necessary to pull themselves out of this Great Depression, that they need some of the resources from the national government. And so this then ushers in a new era of federalism known as cooperative federalism, or sometimes referred to by federalism scholars as fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism because the relationship between national, state, and local governments is now being dictated by the use of money, by the use of federal grants in aid. So the FDR administration comes in and starts issuing these federal grants and aid to try and help state and local governments pull themselves out of the Great Depression. Hence the reason why it now becomes cooperative, because state and local governments are welcoming these grants. These grants are very helpful for them in order to pull them out of the Great Depression. So from the 1930s to the mid 1960s, we have this cooperative fiscal federalism era where the relationship really is being dictated by the granting of money from the national government down to subnational levels as well. Then we get into the mid 1960s. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president. And Johnson had a different approach to federalism than many of his predecessors. Johnson believed in a centralizing approach to federalism. He really believed that decisions need to be made in Washington, D.C., and then those decisions need to be carried out by state and local governments. How do you then get state and local governments to carry out these national decisions and achieve these national objectives? Well, you can use money, you can use grants, or you can use mandates. Grants are the carrot approach, whereby you're giving people money to incentivize their working toward accomplishing these national objectives. Mandates are the stick approach, where if the grants don't work, then you use these direct order mandates where you tell state and local governments, here are the steps and the actions that you must take, oftentimes under civil or criminal threats of penalty. It's referred to as coercive or creative federalism because Johnson had his war on poverty and his Great Society. So he had these national objectives that were established in Washington, D.C., and then he was being creative in finding the tools that would then help him induce or force state and local governments to do what he wanted them to do. Either the use of very specific grants known as categorical grants or the use of direct order mandates. So in the coercive creative federalism era of the Johnson administration, we saw very much of a centralization of power in Washington, D.C. And for good reason, for some from some aspects, because if you think about what was going on in the 1960s, you had a lot of southern states with their Jim Crow laws, the use of poll taxes, removing the right to vote from minority communities. There was a lot of distrust from the national government looking at what state and local governments were doing. And so if you don't trust your partner, if you don't trust state and local governments, you're going to have to force them to take the actions that you think that they should take. So a lot of this was based upon that distrust between national and state and local governments. Then we have, once the Johnson administration ends, we have the Nixon administration come into office. And the Nixon administration in the late 60s and the early 1970s, then followed by the Reagan administration in the 1980s, takes this coercive creative federalism approach and completely turns it on its head. And the approach used by Nixon and Reagan was what was known as a new approach to federalism. So whereas in the coercive creative federalism era, Johnson wanted to make the decisions at the national level and then hand those decisions down to state and local governments and force them to take these actions, Nixon and Reagan believed in inverting the relationship and decentralizing and devolving power down to the local level and allowing local level officials who know what's in the best interest of their citizens, allowing those local level officials to make the decisions and carry out these programs. So new federalism was very much about a decentralization, a devolution of power, and then we'll add our 3D here, which is deregulation. So the 3Ds are decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. Decentralization allows state and local governments to participate in their own decision-making. Devolution, providing them the resources, oftentimes with no strings attached, to go out there and carry out these decisions that they have made. And then deregulation, removing some of these very strict federal regulations on not only state and local governments, but also removing some of these regulations from private industry as well. So whereas in the coercive creative federalism era, Johnson used these categorical, very specific grants of money to hold state and local governments accountable for how they were spending the money. In the new federalism era of Nixon and Reagan, the tool changed. So instead of using very specific grants, at least in the Nixon administration, he used an approach known as general revenue sharing. And general revenue sharing, essentially what he would do is turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue to state and local governments with very few, if any, strings attached, and then tell those state and local governments, you may go out there and spend the money however you see fit to accomplish your goals and objectives. So in terms of the use of grants, we see the use of grants really change over the years. where we had grants being very categorical and specific in the Johnson administration, in the Nixon administration, they became very general, very open-ended with general revenue sharing. And in the Reagan administration, he replaced a lot of the very specific categorical grants with what were known as block grants. And a block grant is a more general grant of money. So in a block grant, you can have some flexibility in terms of how you spend the money, as long as how you are spending the money will help you achieve the goals and objectives. So, an example that we saw in the 1990s was welfare reform. So we replaced the AFDC grants with what were known as temporary assistance to needy family grants, or TANF grants. Those TANF grants could be used in a variety of different ways by the recipient, by the state or local government, especially the state government, as long as how they were spending that money would then help them achieve the goal of moving people from welfare to work. So if you want to spend it on childcare programs, you could. If you want to spend it on job training programs, on computer literacy programs, however you want to spend that money was okay with the national government, as long as it resulted in what we wanted to happen, which is to move people from welfare into gainful employment. One of the reasons why Reagan replaced general revenue sharing with block grants is that when you look at the federal budget from 1968 throughout the 70s and throughout the 1980s, there literally was just no money to share. The federal government was running deficits year after year after year, and every single year those deficits were becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So Reagan realized literally there's no money to share, so there's no real reason to keep general revenue sharing. So he abolished general revenue sharing in 1986 and then took 187 different categorical specific grant programs and kind of shoved them all together into 13 block grant programs. The nice thing about that for state and local governments is they got a lot more flexibility, because no longer were they being held accountable for spending money in certain types of ways, like with a categorical grant. Now, with this block grant, they had a lot more flexibility in how they spent the money. The problem was whenever Reagan took those 187 categorical grants and smushed them all together into 13 block grants, he also took spending away, took funding away. So state and local governments is kind of a bittersweet pill to swallow. They got a lot more flexibility and discretion, but they paid for it by having less money. But again, it kind of shows you just how it's the new federalism era of Nixon and Reagan is diametrically opposed to the centralization efforts that we saw in coercive creative federalism under the Johnson administration. Which then begs the question of, well, where are we now in federalism? What type of era are we currently in? I would argue, and this is my term, I would argue that currently we are in this term known as contextual federalism. And that starts at the end of the Reagan administration and goes to the present point in time. In contextual federalism, when we are deciding which level of government should have the power and the responsibility, we look at the issue. If it should be the federal government versus state government, we look at what the issue is in the context of the issue. In the past with federalism tended to be very ideological. That if you had a Republican conservative president, you would assume that there would be a lot of decentralization and devolution of power. If you had a more liberal or progressive Democratic president, you would assume that there'll be more centralization and more reliance upon decision-making in Washington, D.C. It tended to be very ideological in nature. Today, it's less ideological and much more issue-based, in that we have seen administrations that have at certain points in time decentralized power, at other points in time have really worked very hard to centralize power. And again, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but give you a couple of examples. I mentioned welfare reform before. In 1996, we got this piece of legislation called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. A lot of words that pretty much boils down to welfare reform. As we had said, in welfare reform, you had a Democratic president who worked with a Republican majority in Congress in order to replace specific categorical grants with much broader, much more general block grants, again, for the purpose of moving people from welfare to work. So in that example, you saw a Democratic president really making some efforts to decentralize and devolve decision making in terms of the issue of welfare. However, in another issue in the Clinton administration, blood alcohol content levels for drunk driving, we saw much more of a centralizing type of force. The Clinton administration wanted every single state to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level for drunk driving. Problem is, different states had different blood alcohol content levels. Some had a 0.08, some had a 0.06, some had a 0.10 or a 0.12. Clinton wanted every single state to have the same blood alcohol content level. So what Clinton did is he used these things called crossover mandates, where he told states, until you adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level, we are going to remove highway funds from you. We're going to take highway funds away from you until you come into alignment with what we want you to do. That obviously is a very centralizing top-down type of approach. He took that approach with blood alcohol content levels, took the completely different opposite approach of decentralization when it came to welfare reform. You think about the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration. Most of the policies in the George W. Bush administration were oriented around decentralization and devolution of power and authority. However, you then also had this No Child Left Behind Act. The No Child Left Behind Act was very centralizing in nature in that it established national standards and they required that state and local governments would have to abide by these national standards. And if they didn't abide by these national standards, then they would end up losing federal education funds. A very centralizing approach in terms of K through 12 education, as opposed to decentralization for the vast majority of other policies in the Bush administration. And I think you can kind of see that play out in a lot of our modern day administrations. So oftentimes it's the issue much more so than the ideology. The upshot of all this for us as people who study federalism and intergovernmental relations is that in this era of contextual federalism, it means it's more difficult for us to study federalism. We can't rely upon the letter behind someone's name. We can't just say, well, this person's a Republican, so this is their approach to federalism. Well, this person's a Democrat, so this is their approach to federalism. There still is some ideological influence, obviously, but we have to look at the issue as well, because the issue will probably give us more insight in terms of what that elected official is going to do as opposed to their ideology or their party affiliation. So we have to look at each issue independently when we study the proper balance of power between national, state, and local governments. So I think it's a more appropriate way of studying federalism today, but it also makes our work as federalism scholars a lot more difficult and much more complex to do. That's kind of a basic overview of federalism and intergovernmental relations and kind of give you an idea of how federalism has changed over the years. The question about why federalism has changed over the years really has to do with the US Supreme Court, because the ultimate arbiter of federalism issues and this proper balance of power between national, state, and local governments, the ultimate arbiter of that is obviously the US Supreme Court. So let me just share this out and then we'll take a break. I don't want to delve into this without a break first, but so let's go ahead and take about a 15-minute break, come back after about 15 minutes, and then I want to walk you through some of the ways in which the Supreme Court has defined and redefined the proper balance of power between national, state, and local governments to kind of show you how important Supreme Court interpretation of the Constitution is for our understanding of this balance between the three levels of government. So take about a 15-minute break. We will come back. We'll go through some of these cases very briefly, talk about the influence of the Supreme Court. Then we will turn our attention to looking at the Constitution, looking at the different parts of the Constitution and what they mean for our understanding of federalism. And at that point, I think we'll be able to have done enough work and probably call it an evening at that point. So take 15, come on back, and we'll talk about the Supreme Court's interpretation of federalism. Okay, well, it's 7:40, so we are back from break. And again, like I said before we went on break, what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the ways in which the Supreme Court has interpreted federalism and just kind of underscore why it's so important to recognize the US Supreme Court as the ultimate interpreter of a lot of these different compromises that we saw spelled out in the Constitution. Again, as the reason why federalism tends to be a very dynamic and changing concept. On this form that you, or this page that you see up on the screen, what I've done is just kind of listed out for you some major cases of some major developments in the interpretation of federalism. I don't expect you to memorize these. I'm not going to test you on any of these. It's not a complete comprehensive list of all of the federalism related decisions rendered by the Supreme Court. Just kind of some highlights to show you how the Supreme Court has at certain points in time sided with the national government and other points in time sided with state governments, depending upon the issue, depending upon the period of time, and mostly depending upon the composition of the Supreme Court. So as we know, in the original Constitution, we have in Article 6, Section 2, this thing known as a supremacy clause that says that the Constitution laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land, a very strong pronouncement of national government authority. Then we had the 10 amendments. We had the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. As we know, the 10th Amendment, the Reserved Powers Amendment, says that state governments have all powers are not given to Congress nor denied to the states, are then reserved to the states. And so under the Constitution, Article 6, Section 2, we have this strong pronouncement of national government power. Then the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, we have this strong pronouncement of state government power. Again, conflicting types of provisions. Very soon after that, in 1810, we had this very famous case known as Fletcher versus Peck. And Fletcher versus Peck is the first time that the Supreme Court held a state law to be unconstitutional. And essentially what had happened in this case is the state of Georgia had a contract and an agreement with a Native American tribe. Then the state of Georgia passed a law that basically violated that agreement and said that agreement was null and void. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that that law Georgia passed that said that the agreement was null and void is unconstitutional. So it's the first time we have the Supreme Court exercising judicial review over a state law. And so that, again, is a very important point in time where we now have the national judiciary that is exercising judicial review over state laws. 1819, you have this very important case called McCulloch versus Maryland. It's a case that I would argue is one of the 2 or 3 most important cases in American judicial history. Anyone familiar or remember McCulloch versus Maryland, what that case was all about? It's one of the cases that always or should always be covered in an American government class. I don't know if it always is in every class, but anybody familiar with McCulloch versus Maryland? Essentially, in this case, what we have is we have a situation where Congress had chartered what was called the Second Bank of the United States. Essentially, Congress had created a national bank, which is its constitutional ability to do. And this national bank had different offices. I guess today we probably call them branch offices, but had different offices in a variety of different states. One of the offices was in the state of Maryland in Baltimore. The problem was that you had this national institution that had a presence within the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland had a state law that allowed the state to tax all the fiscal notes that were issued by any bank within the state. So the state of Maryland starts to tax the fiscal notes that are being issued by this national bank. So we have a state government taxing a national government entity. Supreme Court said that a state cannot tax the federal government, established this thing known as reciprocal tax immunity. What for many years was a very important concept in federalism called reciprocal tax immunity. Reciprocal tax immunity essentially says that one level of government may not tax another level of government. In this decision in 1819, the Chief Justice Marshall wrote that the power to tax is equivalent to the power to destroy. So if we allow the state of Maryland to tax a national bank, that's equivalent to allowing the state of Maryland to destroy that national bank. This idea of reciprocal tax immunity was a principle that really hung around for a long time throughout the 1800s into the 1900s. It has started to be eroded by some congressional action in recent years and as well as some Supreme Court decisions. But it essentially says one level of government may not tax another level of government, establishing this separation between governments as these sovereign entities. Really, really important federalism type of case. So 1824, a few years later, we then have this case called Gibbons versus Ogden, sometimes just referred to as the Steamboat case. And essentially, in this case, what had happened is the state of New York had given a monopoly to Fulton and Gibbons to run their steamboats and to sail their steamboats in New York waterways. And it was this monopoly that gave them the sole ability to run steamboats within the state of New York. This was a Commerce Clause case and the first Commerce Clause case that made it to the Supreme Court. The court, in its ruling, affirmed that the federal government's right to regulate interstate trade and lays out a very broad definition of commerce that extends federal authority over the regulation of interstate commerce. Essentially, what the court said is that even though this monopoly applied to the waterways within the state of New York, those waterways connect to other waterways outside of New York. And so ostensibly, these steamboats were not staying in New York, they were going outside of New York. So if New York said only these steamboat companies are the only ones that can traverse the waterways in New York, that does then have an impact upon interstate commerce because other steamboats cannot go through New York and then go to other states. So even though it's happening within the state of New York, it has a broader impact upon interstate commerce. And so this is the first time that the court really read a very broad definition of the right to regulate commerce on the part of Congress. And so this is an example of the Supreme Court siding with the national government and the ability of Congress to exercise its Commerce Clause. A few years later, you had the Wabash case. This just goes by the Wabash case. So it's the Wabash St. Louis versus Pacific Railway versus Illinois. And this case is a similar case to the Gibbons versus Ogden, except it deals with railroads. And instead of monopoly, it dealt with the rates that the state of Illinois was charging to railroads using the railroads within the state of Illinois. The court said that states cannot regulate railroad rates on parts of interstate journeys that fall within their borders for a similar reason that they used in the Gibbons versus Ogden case, because these railroads extend interstate. They extend across many different states. So since this is all one part of an interstate railroad system, you can have a different rate. A state can't charge a different rate for rail lines within their state because those rail lines then extend beyond state boundaries. So again, it is a nod to the federal government and its very expansive Commerce Clause powers, much like what we saw in the Gibbons versus Ogden case. So in that interpretation, again, we have a pretty static interpretation here where the Supreme Court is siding with Congress in exercising its commerce powers. 1925, another important case, and this is an important First Amendment case called Gitlow versus New York. And in Gitlow versus New York, you had a situation where individual Gitlow was publishing what he called his left-wing manifesto. It was essentially just another name for a communist manifesto. So he wanted to publish this left-wing manifesto. The state of New York arrested him for trying to publish this manifesto. The Supreme Court ruled in Gitlow's favor and extended the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech and freedom of press to include limitations against state government actions as well as actions taken by the national government. This is a very important concept in federalism known as incorporation. So initially, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, all those protections and freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, protection against double jeopardy, protection against self-incrimination, protection against unwarrantable search and seizure, all of these protections that are provided for you in the Bill of Rights. Initially, the Supreme Court read those protections as protections against national government action. Because again, they were put in there for the purpose of allaying the concerns of the anti-federalists that the national government would become too strong. So the Supreme Court said all those protections apply to limitations against the national government, but did not apply to limitations against state governments. The process of applying those freedoms to include limitations against state as well as the national government, that process is what's known as incorporation. So whenever a right gets incorporated, that means that the court is saying not only can the federal government not violate this right, but state governments may not violate this right either. Some of the rights in the Bill of Rights have been fully incorporated to include limitations against state government action. Some rights have never been fully incorporated. As we go through the first 10 amendments of the Constitution in a couple minutes, I will illustrate to you which ones have been incorporated, which ones have not been incorporated, and sometimes a very painful process of incorporating these protections to include state governments. But here in the Gitlow versus New York case, your First Amendment protections are now incorporated to include limitations against state governments as well as the national government. Another important case in 1942, the Wickard versus Filburn case. This case dealt with an Ohio farmer, and that Ohio farmer was growing wheat. At that point in time, because you're looking at 1942, you're looking at World War II, the national government had limitations that they placed upon wheat production. So as a wheat farmer, you could only produce so much wheat. This farmer produced more than he was allowed to produce in wheat, but his argument was all that excess wheat was not being sold. He wasn't selling it. It wasn't going as part of the marketplace. So therefore, it should not be covered under the Commerce Clause because there was no commerce happening. He just happened to grow more than he was allowed to make. The court ruled that the federal government has the power to regulate economic activity under the Commerce Clause. Even though this farmer was not selling the wheat, Congress still had the ability to limit the amount of wheat that he was growing, even though that wheat was not part of interstate commerce. So in Wicker versus Filburn, you have a very expansive definition by the Supreme Court of what constitutes interstate commerce. Doesn't even have to be something that's being sold in order for Congress to be able to regulate it under the Commerce Clause. So here again, we're seeing a nod toward the national government and Congress's Commerce Clause powers. 1964, remember we had said that states, one of their powers is to conduct their elections. Well, in this one, in Westbury versus Sanders, we had a case where states were drawing congressional districts, and the Supreme Court said that states must draw their congressional districts in nearly equal proportions. So states cannot draw one district one size, another district another size. Every congressional district, every House district must be of relatively equal size. So here we have the Supreme Court stepping in and regulating the power to conduct elections on the part of state governments. So again, here we see the federal government or the Supreme Court increasing the power of the federal government over an activity that traditionally is an activity that's under the auspices and domain of state governments. 72, we have Furman versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court rules that all existing death penalty laws violate the Constitution. They cited arbitrariness and racial imbalances in the application of death penalties. And what it made states do is it basically said your state death penalty law is unconstitutional. You have to go back and rewrite your death penalty law. So this is, again, the Supreme Court placing limitations on the ability of state governments to pass death penalty laws. 4 years later, in the Gregg versus Georgia case, death penalty statutes were then generally upheld by the court's decision. So the court kind of reverses itself 4 years later and says, okay, we're going to defer to states and allow states to go ahead and write their own death penalty laws. And so in 72, you have the Supreme Court coming with a blanket striking down of all death penalty laws across the states, the 1976 sanctioning the ability of states to pass their own death penalty approaches. This is an example of how the Supreme Court sometimes, I hate to use the term flip-flops, but will flip-flop and will completely change its opinion. A case I don't have up on here that's a really important case for federalism that's covered in several of the articles that we read this term is a case called National League of Cities versus Usury. Put that in the text chat. Usually just called NLC versus Usury. And that's a case from 1976. oops, talk and type at the same time. National League versus Cities versus Usury. In the National League of Cities versus Usury case in 1976, Congress tried to apply minimum wage requirements from the Fair Labor Standards Act to include state and local governments, whereby basically Congress was saying, state and local governments, you must abide by these minimum wage requirements that Congress has passed in the Fair Labor Standards Act. State and local governments obviously complain about that. They say, what we pay our employees as sovereign entities, that's up to us. And that's something that Congress can't tell us what to do. So National League of Cities ended up taking the case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court sided with state and local governments and said what governments pay their employees is considered to be, quote unquote, an essential function of government. What you pay your employee is an essential function. Essential functions of government should be left to state and local governments and should not be something that Congress can tell state and local governments what and how to do it. So in National League of Cities versus Usury, the Supreme Court provided protection to state and local governments, allowing them to pay whatever they want to pay to their state and local employees. That was in 1976. 9 years later, in a case called Garcia versus Samta, I'll put that in text chat as well. That's in 1986. So we're talking, well, 1865, 1986. Actually, it's 1985, I'm sorry. It's 9 years later in 1985, you have the case called Garcia versus SAMTA. SAMTA is an acronym that stands for the San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority. In Garcia versus SAMTA, you have the exact same facts of the case that you had in NLC versus Usury. We had some amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1985, and as part of those amendments, Congress once again tried to apply minimum wage requirements to state and local employees. State and local governments then once again complain and say, Supreme Court in 1976 said we didn't have to, so we're going to take the case all the way back up to the Supreme Court again. Same facts went up to the Supreme Court, a different composition on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled the complete opposite. Whereas in 1976, they said what you pay your employees is an essential function. In 1985, in Garcia versus SAMTA, they say we were wrong in 1976. When we said what you pay your employees is an essential function, we're judges, we're justices. We do not know what an essential function of government is. So we were wrong in 1976, protecting you from this congressional action. The difference here and what's very important is that you can see in 9 years, the Supreme Court came to a completely different conclusion than it came to in 1976. And that was due primarily to the composition of the court had changed. And essentially what had happened is in National League of Cities versus Usury, the Supreme Court declared it to be a constitutional issue. They said that state governments are sovereign entities. As sovereign entities, they can then determine what to pay their employees. In 1985, they say, well, we can't really say what's an essential function of government. So instead of you having constitutional protection, state and local governments, this is much more of a political issue. And this is very important for our discussion of interpretation of the Constitution. At some points in time, the Supreme Court will determine an issue to be constitutional, like they did in 1976. When they consider an issue to be constitutional, it means that state and local governments can then go through the court system for redress of their grievances against Congress. However, when the Supreme Court says this is not a constitutional issue, this is a political issue, then state and local governments can no longer use the judicial system, and instead they have to go and push back on Congress with political strategies such as lobbying. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to read an article, Governments as Interest Groups by Camissa, which gives us a good overview of how state and local government organizations lobby Congress and some of the reasons why they lobby Congress. Well, oftentimes they're going to lobby Congress because the Supreme Court tells them they have to. We won't give you constitutional protection. All protections that you can find, you must find in the political world. Lobby Congress just as any individual or any other interest group would lobby Congress. So it's important because at some points in time, issues are determined to be constitutional. At other points in time, they are considered to be political. And whether it's constitutional or political will certainly dictate how state and local governments will push back on Congress whenever Congress tries to extend its power over state and local governments. 1992, we had a case, United States versus New York. This is an important case for state and local governments because for the first time, really, we had a justice who just passed away actually a few days ago, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who in her majority decision wrote that the 10th Amendment is just as important as the other 9 amendments to the Bill of Rights. Her decision elevated the 10th Amendment to the status of other amendments, and the whole details of this case, essentially what was going on is Congress was requiring state governments to take ownership of low-level radioactive waste. We had a low-level radioactive waste policy act. And so they were requiring each individual state to take title or take ownership of that low-level radioactive waste. Obviously, states did not want to do that, so they took their case to the Supreme Court. Essentially, what Senator Day O'Connor said in her decision is that the Reserve Powers Amendment means that this is a power that has not been given to Congress, and so this is a power that devolves down to the states, and that the 10th Amendment needs to be elevated to the same level of prominence as the First Amendment, or the Fourth Amendment, or the Fifth Amendment. And it's really the first time that we saw the Supreme Court really elevate the 10th Amendment in terms of its importance and significance. So this is a very big win for state governments, and it really did foreshadow some other victories that state and local governments got from the court in the 1990s as well. 1992, there's a case called Quill versus North Dakota that dealt with remote sellers. Today, we're very familiar with making purchases on the internet. Back in 1992, in the Quill versus North Dakota case, this was actually a stationery case. You had a stationery company named Quill Corporation. It was based in the state of Minnesota. It was then had a mail order business where it was conducting business with residents from North Dakota. North Dakota Department of Revenue wanted to tax those mail order transactions, saying these are North Dakota residents, so therefore we should be able to tax them. Quill Corporation pushed back and said, we don't have a physical presence in North Dakota. All of our offices, our production facilities, everything is located in the state of Minnesota. So therefore, North Dakota, you cannot tax our transactions. Supreme Court sided with Quill Corporation and said that states may not tax sales conducted by what they consider to be remote sellers. Any seller, any corporation that did not have a physical presence within the state, you could not apply your sales tax to transactions conducted by that corporation. This was a major limitation on the ability of state governments to collect revenue. And what eventually happened is once the internet exploded, once e-commerce exploded, e-commerce fell under this Quill versus North Dakota decision. And so states could not tax transactions between their residents and an out-of-state corporation. So the only way they could tax it is if that corporation had some brick and mortar physical presence within the state. So again, this is a limitation then on state taxing power. 1995, we have a case called United States versus Lopez. In this case, the court struck down what was called the Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990. They struck it down based upon the grounds that the federal government invaded the reserve powers of the state with the Gun-Free School Zone Act. Essentially, what they're saying is that you cannot require states to create this gun-free school zone around your schools because that's not something that is provided to you as a power in the Constitution. This is not a Commerce Clause type of power because we're talking about schools that are all contained within the boundaries of a state. A couple of years later, we have another very important case, the Prince versus United States case. In this case, we had a challenge to the Brady Act. And in the 1980s, 1981, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, there's an assassination attempt on President Reagan. His press secretary, Brady, was shot in the head as a result of that assassination attack, and then spent the rest of his life trying to advocate for gun control. And eventually was successful at getting Congress to pass this Brady Act. And the Brady Act, or the Brady Bill, what the legislation did is it required state and local law enforcement officials to conduct background checks of handgun buyers. In the Prince versus United States case, the court said that they struck down that provision of the Brady Bill because they're saying that the Congress cannot require state and local governments to take actions that are not directly tied to interstate commerce. It's what's come to be known as the Prince entitlement. The state and local governments have this Prince entitlement where the Congress and the national government cannot tell them to do things under the Commerce Clause if it doesn't directly affect interstate commerce. Now, there have been a series of cases after that that have reinstated background checks and allowed background checks, but it makes it very difficult for Congress to use these background checks, or require these background checks under their Commerce Clause. So the Commerce Clause power really has been narrowed a little bit by the courts with this Prince versus United States case. In Reno versus Condon, you have a federal law that prohibited states from selling databases of personal information, so driver's license information, things such as that, on the grounds that it's proper federal regulation of interstate commerce. So essentially what they said is Congress may limit the ability of states to sell personal information from these databases because Congress can do that under their commerce power. So this kind of broadens out the commerce power a bit. United States versus Morrison had to do with this piece of legislation known as the Violence Against Women Act. In 1994, you had this Violence Against Women Act that, among other things, provided victims with the opportunity and the right to sue in federal court. This act, according to the Supreme Court, this part of the act, exceeded congressional power under the Commerce Clause because it was not directly tied to economic activity. So here in 2000, in the United States versus Morrison case, we've got the Supreme Court further narrowing the commerce power of Congress, saying that it has to be economic in nature before Congress can use their Commerce Clause power. So this is a further narrowing of the Commerce Clause power of Congress. It has to have that direct nexus, that direct connection to economic interstate activity. In the Nevada versus Hibbs case, the court allows state workers to sue states for damages if the state fails to obey the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. And so again, this is a limitation on states and saying that states can be sued by their own citizens. Typically, if you're a sovereign entity, in order to be sued, you have to consent to be sued. And here the Supreme Court is saying states don't have to consent to be sued. They can be forced to be sued because of congressional legislation. In the Gonzalez versus Raich case, I'm not going to spend much time on this because there is a medical marijuana article that someone will lead a discussion on later this term. But under this case, the Supreme Court said that Congress may criminalize the production of cannabis and its use, even if states have approved its use for medical purposes. So a lot of states at this time in the early 2000s were approving medical use of medical marijuana. In this case, the Supreme Court is saying, well, federal law trumps state law. And so if the states do want to prosecute someone for medical use of marijuana, they can, even if the state says that it is okay. Again, a lot of this has become moot as a result of the way in which the federal government has decided not to enforce federal marijuana law, and the fact that the Biden administration is actually making strides toward removing marijuana from the controlled substance list at the federal level. Gonzalez versus Carhart, this was a move toward limiting abortion rights. They upheld the 2003 partial birth abortion ban, so upholding Congress's right to legislate in terms of partial birth abortions. The 2013 Shelby versus Holder case I had mentioned before, this is where the Supreme Court struck down the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act, which is a big win for a lot of southern states because they no longer had to get their maps pre-cleared from the Department of Justice. 2014, the case of Town of Greece versus Galloway. Here we had council meetings that were starting with a Christian prayer. And the Supreme Court said that having a Christian prayer at the beginning of council meeting does not violate the constitutional provision against establishment of religion. So it allows local governments to engage in that. Obergefell versus Hodges, you're probably very familiar with this case. The court found that state bans on same-sex marriage violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So again, a limitation on the ability of states to outlaw same-sex marriage. 2018, we had the South Carolina versus Wayfair case. This case undoes what was done back in 1992 in Cole versus North Dakota. In South Carolina versus Wayfair, the court said that states may tax sales by remote sellers, opening up greatly the access that state governments have to collecting sales tax revenue on e-commerce. So as you can see with just this very brief discussion, a highlight of different cases, the Supreme Court really has a major role to play in determining the proper balance of power between national, state, and local governments. It really serves as this ultimate arbiter of this balance of power. At some points in time, we've seen the Supreme Court side with Congress and side with the federal government in limiting the constitutional powers of state governments. At other times, we've seen the Supreme Court provide constitutional protections to state and local governments against the intrusion of federal power and the use of the Commerce Clause and Elastic Clause. It really does depend upon the issue, the period of time, as well as the composition of the Supreme Court. The composition of the current Supreme Court, as you're probably familiar, is a very conservative composition, probably the most conservative composition that we have seen in generations in the Supreme Court. So we essentially are looking at a more or less a 6-3 conservative majority in the Supreme Court. So that does then obviously color a lot of the decisions that are made by the Supreme Court. But again, the underscore here and the basic theme is that federalism is dynamic, it is subject to interpretation, and the ultimate arbiter tends to be the US Supreme Court. So what then does the Constitution say? We've got to go back and look at the original Constitution, see what the Constitution says about the proper balance of power between federal and state governments. So in the last part of class here, what I'd like to do is go through the Constitution, but not really go through it with a fine-tooth comb. I hope you've read the Constitution before. Now in our PPA 500 classes, whether it's in the DL program or the stateside program, we now go through the Constitution, spend a couple hours going through every single article, all 7 articles, all 27 amendments. I don't want to do that here in that exhaustive of a fashion. Rather, what I'd like to do is kind of hit the highlights of the Constitution as they pertain to the balance of power between national and state governments. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the Constitution. Do have it attached on our Canvas site. So let's just go through the 7 articles of the Constitution. Again, the Constitution is a very well organized document. The framers devote different topics to different articles. So you've got Article 1 that deals with Congress. You have Article 2 that deals with the executive branch, the presidency. You got Article 3 that deals with the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. Article 4 deals primarily with full and faith credit being provided from one state to another. The Fifth Amendment deals primarily with the fifth article, deals primarily with how we amend the Constitution. 6th article speaks to the supremacy of the national government. And then the 7th article talks about how the Constitution then gets ratified by 9 out of the 13 states. But let's start with Article 1. Article 1 is by far the most detailed and the lengthiest article in the entire Constitution. Article 1, Section 1 is where we spell out this idea of a bicameral legislature. Again, this is your Connecticut Compromise, the creation of a House of Representatives and the creation of a U.S. Senate. A bicameral legislature was not completely novel in the late 1700s, but it was highly unusual. And so this creation is something that a lot of other nations weren't familiar with. But some of our state constitutions actually had bicameral legislatures. And so it wasn't something that was brand new, a brand new notion for many people at the time. In Article 1, Section 2, we get into a discussion of the House of Representatives. In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, as we know, you have to be at least 25 years old. You must be at least 7 years a citizen of the United States, and you must live in the state in which you are representing. So the standards of being in the House of Representatives are relatively low at 25 years old. This is the House that was supposed to be closest to the people. It is based upon proportional representation. And so this is basically the Virginia plan part of our bicameral Congress. We decide the number of representatives based upon this enumeration. We know that every 10 years we do an enumeration. We just had that enumeration in 2020. And so states are designing, or they have designed their congressional districts, their new district maps that will then govern the representation, their representation in the House of Representatives. We also have this provision in here that if a vacancy occurs in the House, that the governor, the chief executive, is able to make an appointment to fill that vacancy. We have a very recent vacancy in the House because of George Santos and his expulsion from the House. And so we'll end up having a special election in New York. We also had a representative who left relatively recently from the state of Utah, Chris Stewart. His seat has already been filled. And then we had a representative from Rhode Island, a Democrat, who also resigned a few months ago, and his seat has been filled as well. But by giving the governor, the chief executive, the ability to fill these seats, that is a nod more toward the states as opposed to popular sentiment, because now you're allowing the chief executive of the state to fill those vacancies. In the House of Representatives, the Constitution says that you will have a Speaker of the House and then other officers as the House will choose. So the Speaker of the House is a constitutional position. It's a constitutional position that's essentially second in line for the presidency. First in line is obviously the Vice President of the United States. Second in line then is the Speaker of the House, who is currently Mike Johnson. So we have proportional representation in the House of Representatives. But to ameliorate a lot of the concerns of the anti-federalists, then in Section 3, we then introduce this idea of the U.S. Senate. And for the U.S. Senate, the members of the Senate are not popularly elected. So they're popularly elected in the House. The members of the Senate will be selected by state legislatures. So this is a nod to anti-federalists and a nod to the states, so the states can determine, state legislatures can determine who their representatives will be in the U.S. Senate. Whereas members of the House serve 2-year terms, members of the Senate obviously serve 6-year terms. So it's the much more remote House of Congress. In order to be in the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old. So we're increasing that requirement. You also have to be 9 years a citizen of the United States, again, increasing that requirement as well, hoping to get a more seasoned type of politicians into the U.S. Senate. You can make an argument as to whether or not that actually happened. The Senate is headed up by the Vice President of the United States, who only votes in terms of a tie. And I don't know if you've been watching the news recently, but Vice President Harris just got a golden gavel given to her by the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer because she recently broke a tie for the 32nd time, which is the most ties ever broken by a sitting vice president. So that's a little bit of history that just recently happened, which I think just kind of shows us how evenly split the Senate is. We've got a 51-49 split in the Senate. It becomes very easy for votes to become 50-50. And then that's when the vice president comes in and breaks the tie. The functional leader of the Senate is the president pro tem of the Senate. The president pro tem of the Senate is the longest serving senator from the majority party. And so Patty Murray is currently the president pro tem of the Senate. President pro tem of the Senate is then next in line behind the Speaker of the House for filling the office of president if necessary. But again, the Senate is really designed to be more state-centric and really designed to be more further removed from popular sentiment and from the people. A lot of other things, again, we're not going to get into all the details that are covered here. But again, we've got this bicameral legislature and the nod to the states in terms of not having direct election of members of the U.S. Senate. Section 7 is an interesting one because in Article 1, Section 7, we lay out all the provisions by which legislation gets passed and signed by the president. So any bill that has to do with increasing revenue must start in the House of Representatives. That was done on purpose because the framers felt that everyday average citizens would be most interested in having their taxes increase. And so therefore, if you have those bills start in the House of Representatives, those members of the House are only serving 2-year terms. They're popularly elected. So individual citizens will have a whole lot more influence on members of the House. Before a bill can go to the president for the president's signature, it must pass the House and the Senate in identical versions. That is something that's difficult to do. Once a bill makes its way through the House, oftentimes looks a lot different than how it looks once it makes its way through the Senate. This is why we then have conference committees that hammer out the details between the House and the Senate version, and it must be identical version, must be one uniform piece of legislation before it can then go to the president for the president's signature. We also know that the House and the Senate can override a presidential veto. That's a difficult thing to do. You need a supermajority to do that. It's very rare that Congress is able to override a presidential veto. As we mentioned before, Article 1, Section 8 is the lengthiest and most detailed of all the sections in the Constitution. This is where we lay out all the powers, the enumerated powers of Congress: power to lay and collect taxation, to borrow money, to regulate commerce. This is your Commerce Clause. To establish uniform rules of naturalization, to coin money, to provide punishment and counterfeiting of securities and current coin of the United States, to establish post offices and postal roads, to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Now, this is why we have a National Science Foundation and funding for that. Constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. This allowed Congress to establish the entire federal judiciary located underneath that U.S. Supreme Court. Punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas. The ability to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain navy, to make rules of government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to call forth a militia, to provide for organizing army and disciplining the militia. Exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as made by session of particular state, blah, blah, blah. Basically, District of Columbia, which means that Congress has control over the District of Columbia. And then when you get to the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, this is where we talked about the elastic clause. The ability to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying into execution foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So this gives Congress the ability to make any laws that they deem necessary in order to allow them to carry out all these enumerated listed powers that were provided earlier in Article 1, Section 8. When Congress tends to try and expand its power over state and local governments in our federal system, it tends to do that leveraging the elastic clause and or the Commerce Clause. So those are the two big parts from Article 1, Section 8 that Congress relies upon when it tries to expand its power or sometimes even usurp the powers of state and local government. And you notice in our discussion of some of those Supreme Court cases, a lot of them dealt with the Commerce Clause. At certain points in time, the U.S. Supreme Court really making the Commerce Clause more, making it larger and making it easier for Congress to use it. At other times, contracting the Commerce Clause and saying, well, Congress, you can only use this power under the Commerce Clause if it has to do with economic activity that crosses state borders. So a lot of that interpretation of congressional power has been done around the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Section 9 places limitations upon what Congress can do. So the first thing you see there under Article 1, Section 9 is, unfortunately, this prohibition against banning the slave trade into at least the year 1808. Congress may not remove the privilege of writ of habeas corpus unless there's a rebellion or invasion. Writ of habeas corpus is literally translated to present the body. And so with a writ of habeas corpus, if you arrest someone, you essentially have to say you have them, you've arrested them, this is where they are, this is where what they're charged with, and you have to make that information public. Congress cannot suspend that unless there is an invasion or rebellion. We did see in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War under that invasion rebellion type of clause. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. A bill of attainder is essentially saying someone is guilty without a trial. And so you cannot declare someone guilty unless they have the benefit of a trial. An ex post facto law is an after the fact law. And so an ex post facto law, if you did something yesterday and it was legal yesterday, then today we pass a law saying it's illegal and we go back and we try you for committing a crime when it wasn't a crime. You can't have that type of after the fact ex post facto law. Uh, and some other thing, another really important one here is the no money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations. This is the appropriations clause. This means that Congress cannot just spend money without saying how they're going to spend money. Appropriation is saying how the money is going to be spent, how much is being spent, and what that money is being spent on. So Congress must first appropriate those funds, say how the money is being spent before they're allowed to spend that money. Article 1, Section 10 then puts some limitations upon state governments. So in Article 1, Section 10, a lot of the limitations we place on the Congress, we now place upon state governments as well. In Article 1, Section 10, we say no state shall enter into a treaty, alliance, or confederation. So treaties are only the sole domain of the national government. They are not allowable practice on the part of state governments. No titles of nobility, just like Congress can't issue titles of nobility, state governments can't issue titles of nobility either. You have limitations in terms of laying duties on imports or exports at the state level. You also, as a state, you can't keep troops or ships of war in time of peace. You can't enter into any agreement or compact with other states unless you have the approval of Congress. There's an article that we will read in a couple of weeks that talks about interstate compacts and how interstate compacts are a major tool of cooperation between some state governments. For it to actually be truly an interstate compact, it must first be authorized by Congress. So a lot of the things we call compacts, agreements between states, are much more unofficial in nature because they have never actually been approved by Congress. So in Article 1, we deal primarily with this is what Congress is, this is what Congress can do, this is what Congress cannot do, and then here's what state governments cannot do either. And so we place both powers as well as limitations. Article 2 then deals with the executive branch and the president. And again, we won't go through all this in painstaking detail, but we know that to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old. So we're kind of ratcheting up those requirements a little bit to be president. And you also have to be a natural born citizen. You have to be born in the United States. You have to be a natural born citizen. So again, much narrower types of requirements in order to be president. We established this electoral college. You're probably all familiar with the electoral college, but we established the idea of the electoral college. The electoral college was designed by the framers for a couple of reasons. One reason the framers designed the electoral college is that they were concerned about popular sentiment. They wanted to make sure that these electors who would actually be selecting the president were people who were very well versed in politics, were very well versed in government. So they weren't just your average ordinary citizen, because the framers did have a good bit of distrust in the decision making of average ordinary citizens. Again, like we said, they were all white male property owners. They were the creditors. They were the ones from the quote unquote upper crust of society. So there was some disdain that they had for decisions made by average citizens. But a second reason, a federalism related reason for why we have the electoral college, is the power that it gives to states. So in the electoral college, what we're doing is we are making sure that state governments, all state governments, will have some say in the selection of the president. When you think about the way in which the electoral college works, every state has a number of electors equal to the number of representatives in the House of Representatives plus the number of senators they have in the US Senate. So it's the number you have in the House of Representatives plus 2 for the members, your 2 members of the Senate. So by having that 2 added on, you at least know that small states will at least have a few electoral votes. You know, the minimum number of electoral votes that you can possibly have as a state or as a territory is 3. District of Columbia has 3 electoral votes. I believe Montana has 3 electoral votes. So your very less populated states are going to have fewer electoral votes. But at least by having that provision of 2 added in there, it at least gives them some recognition. And so I think it was that state protection idea that also helped build into the creation of this electoral college. Now, the electoral college today works a lot differently than the electoral college as it was originally designed in the Constitution. Originally, the framers, as we said, had hoped that the electors would be very knowledgeable about government, very knowledgeable about politics. Today, the Electoral College is really dominated by the two major political parties. So, whenever you go and vote in a presidential election, you're voting for a name on the ballot, but that name on the ballot then is attached to a list of electors. So, what you're really doing is you're voting for this list of electors. These electors who are then bound to this candidate and to this political party are the ones that will then go in their state capital in December and then will cast their votes. So it's really the major political parties today that are very much in control of the Electoral College. I think it's one of the reasons why several states are trying to move away from the Electoral College. You have a movement where several states have signed on to uniform legislation whereby they will award their electoral votes to the person who won the popular vote nationwide. And California is a signatory on that as well. Once you get up to enough states to constitute 270 electoral college votes, then essentially the electoral college as we know it kind of goes away. So we'll have to see how that goes. They've got up over 200 electoral votes right now. We'll have to see if they can get up to that 270. This doesn't have a whole lot to do with federalism, but an interesting thing here is in terms of the oath that presidents have to take. Presidents have to take the oath. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. This is a constitutionally mandated oath. And when the Obama administration, with Obama was inaugurated, at his inauguration, Chief Justice Roberts screwed up the oath. And he said the oath incorrectly. And he was so concerned about Obama not actually being president because he didn't take the oath correctly that he demanded that the next day he come to the Oval Office and re-administer the oath to President Obama. And he took it that seriously. Some of the lawyers for former President Trump are now saying that he did not ever take an oath to support the Constitution because support the Constitution, those words are not in the oath. The oath talks about to faithfully execute the office of the president to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend. And the argument is, well, it doesn't say support. And so therefore he cannot be excluded from ballots for not supporting the Constitution. Very interesting legal argument. The president is given the role of many different roles as chief. He is commander, or they are commander in chief of the armed forces. Putting a civilian in charge of the armed forces was intentional on the part of the framers. Presidents also are chief diplomats in that they enter into treaties with foreign nations under the advice and consent of the Senate. They are chief of state in that they engage in foreign relations and trips to foreign nations representing the United States. They are chief legislators in that there is a provision in here that says that presidents may recommend legislation to Congress for its consideration. So we oftentimes in our basic civics understanding of American government say, well, the Congress passes the laws and then the president executes and implements those laws. Well, presidents also have a responsibility for recommending legislation to Congress for Congress's consideration. Presidents have to give a State of the Union address. Now, it doesn't say necessarily how often, doesn't say where, in which time to time, they must give an update on the State of the Union to Congress. We know that there is an impeachment process that is involved here, whereby in order for a president to be removed from office, they must first be impeached by the House of Representatives. That can be done by a majority vote. You just need a majority vote to pass articles of impeachment. Those articles of impeachment then go to the Senate. The Senate then conducts a trial. And in order to remove a president, the Senate would have to convict that president by a 2/3 vote. At that trial, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over that trial. And then if you achieve that 2/3 vote, you can then find the president guilty and can then remove the president from office. We've never had a situation where a president has been removed from office. We've had situations where presidents have been impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached in the 1860s and survived removal by one vote. Bill Clinton was impeached in the late 1990s and survived removal by many votes. And then President Trump was impeached twice during his 4 years in office and again, survived removal as well. So we've never had a president removed based upon impeachment. Article 3 just sets up the United States Supreme Court, and then all other courts inferior to the U.S. Supreme Court were established in the Judiciary Act by the U.S. Congress. Now, the interesting thing about the Supreme Court is there are no requirements to be a member of the Supreme Court. There's also nothing in here about how large the Supreme Court needs to be. FDR, when he was president, threatened to pack the court, wanted to increase the size of the court up to 15. You've had some people talking today about trying to increase the court size as well, but there are no provision in terms of how large the court needs to be, and again, no qualifications to serve as a Supreme Court justice. The importance, obviously, of the Supreme Court is, as we have discussed, it is the ultimate arbiter of issues of federalism. And so as federalism cases make their way through the state court system, they will then make their way up to the federal court system, typically go through the 94, we have 94 trial courts, 13 courts of appeal, and then eventually reach the Supreme Court. The vast majority, 99.9999% of cases, reach the Supreme Court through what we call appellate jurisdiction. They get appeal from state courts up through federal courts, and then finally get appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court does not have to hear cases. In fact, the vast majority of cases that make it to the Supreme Court are never heard by the Supreme Court. In order to hear a case, they have to grant what is called a writ of certiorari, sometimes it's called a writ of cert. And you got to get that writ of cert first before the Supreme Court will agree to have oral arguments for your case. Article 4 is very important for our study of federalism because Section 1 talks about full faith and credit. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. This means that one state must respect the laws and the acts of another state. This tells us essentially that states must treat each other as equals in terms of their legislation. Article 5 talks about how we amend the Constitution. Again, this is important for our study of federalism because the framers intentionally put a role in here for state governments. They wanted states involved in the ratification of amendments to the Constitution. So the primary way in which we amend the Constitution, a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate to propose an amendment, and then that amendment gets ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That is the only approach we have ever used to amend the Constitution. But you should know that there are 3 other potential ways in which you can amend the Constitution. A second way you can amend the Constitution is proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. So that's a second way you can do it. A third way you can do it is have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then have those amendments that come out of that constitutional convention ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. And then the fourth way you can do it, 2/3 of the states can petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then amendments that come out of that convention can then be ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. We've only used approach number 1 because that's the approach that avoids constitutional conventions. Because we saw what happened in the last time we had a constitutional convention. We took our existing constitution, the Articles of Confederation, threw it out and replaced it with a brand new, much different constitution. So there's concern that if we have either national or state constitutional conventions, the same type of thing may happen. So we always amend the Constitution with 2/3 proposal of the House and the Senate and ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. Article 6, the second section of Article 6 there, the Constitution, the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So this is your supremacy clause that stands in stark contrast to the Reserve Powers Amendment and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Then, of course, Article 7, as we said, is just how the Constitution, original Constitution, would get ratified. But as we had discussed, coming out of the Constitutional Convention, we were relatively successful at getting 10 states to ratify the Constitution within about a 2-year period of time. But the problem was you still had resistance on the part of the anti-federalists. You still had resistance on the part of the citizens of New York. And so that's why we have these first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights added on to the Constitution. And that's why we had those 85 Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. So let's take a look at the amendments to the Constitution. Again, the first 10, the Bill of Rights, and then we have additional that get us up to a total of 27 amendments to the Constitution throughout our history. The First Amendment you're very familiar with. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These are your two aspects of freedom of religion. One's called the Establishment Clause. One is called the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause says that you essentially can believe anything that you want to believe, that Congress will not create a national religion. Your ability to believe whatever you want to believe is relatively unfettered. And so that is a pretty blanket type of protection. In terms of the second clause, the Exercise Clause, there can be some limitations placed upon your ability to freely exercise your religious beliefs. And so if you're exercising your religious beliefs places the public at harm, if there's a sacrifice type of aspect of exercising a religion, that obviously cannot be done in the public. It could place people in harm's way. So there can be some limitations upon your ability to freely exercise your religion. Or abridging freedom of speech or of the press. Here again, we do have some exceptions to this blanket provision. Freedom of speech. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a very famous Supreme Court justice who said, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. You yell fire in a crowded theater, you're putting people in harm's way. That's a limitation upon your freedom of speech. Freedom of press, for the most part, we have pretty blanket protections in terms of freedom of press. One of the main ways in which governments can limit freedom of the press or try to is through what's called prior restraint. And in that Gitlow versus New York case that we had talked about earlier, that was an example of prior restraint, where New York was trying to keep this left-wing manifesto from being published. For the most part, courts take a very dim view of prior restraint, keeping things from being published before they can be published. The right of people to peaceably assemble. Again, there can be some limitations placed upon that. So sometimes if you are going to hold a demonstration, you have to go out there and get a permit from the city so that they know where you're demonstrating, what time of day you are demonstrating. So sometimes for public safety purposes, governments can place a limitation upon your right to peaceably assemble. So all these rights are not necessarily unfettered blanket rights. There are some limitations that are applied based upon the potential to threaten public safety. Second Amendment is your right to bear arms. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Obviously, we argue about this one all the time. There are some folks who say, well, we're going to just forget about the well-regulated militia and just say there can be no limitations on the ability of the right to people to bear arms. Others will say, well, you have to read it within context. And there's a reason why the framers put a well-regulated militia. If you are really interested in this discussion, whenever we are wondering what the framers thought when they were writing parts of the Constitution, a good place to go is the Federalist Papers. And there are some Federalist Papers, I believe it's number 45 or 46, in which Hamilton very clearly talks about what he meant by a well-regulated militia. So much so that he actually talks about how often that well-regulated militia needs to meet, whether or not that well-regulated militia needs to drill in order to be a well-regulated militia, and really gives us some specifics about what he meant by a well-regulated militia. So it's kind of hard after reading that Federalist paper to say, well, it wasn't intended to mean anything. But I really leave it up to you to go and read those Federalist papers and see what the framers really did mean. Interesting thing about your Second Amendment protection, the Second Amendment has never been fully incorporated to include limitations on state governments as well. That's why we see different gun control laws that are allowed in different parts of the country. So gun control laws in California are a lot different than gun control laws in Texas. gun control laws in Los Angeles are a lot different than gun control laws in, Kennesaw, Georgia. And so though that right has never been fully incorporated, which does allow a variety of different approaches to limiting gun ownership. Third Amendment is a privacy amendment, no quartering of soldiers. And so no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. This is part of your implied right to privacy. This combined with some other amendments give you this, what the court has called umbrella of privacy. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. This is why police have to get a search warrant before they can search your stuff. This is, again, a privacy type of protection. Fifth Amendment, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentation or indictment of a grand jury. So this is why you have to do an indictment by a grand jury before you stand trial for those types of crimes. No person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. This is your protection against double jeopardy. This is an interesting one because it took many years for the Supreme Court to incorporate your double jeopardy protection to include limitations on state government action as well. There's a very famous case in the 1930s called Palco versus Connecticut. And in that case, this gentleman, Frederick Palco, was charged with first-degree murder by the state of Connecticut. He had his trial, and the state of Connecticut was successful at getting him convicted on second-degree murder charges. But they weren't happy with that because second-degree murder didn't carry the death penalty. Only first-degree murder did. So the state of Connecticut decided, well, we're going to try him again. So they tried him again for the exact same crime, exact same details and witnesses and everything, just a different jury. And this second time, they got him convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to the death penalty. Obviously, Palco complains and says, this is a violation of my Fifth Amendment protections. This is a violation of double jeopardy. Case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Palco versus Connecticut said, sorry, protections against double jeopardy only apply to the national government. Your Fifth Amendment protections do not include protections against the state government as well. Unfortunately, Palco was executed. 30 years later, in 1968, a case called Benton versus Maryland, the Supreme Court said that they were wrong and said, well, sorry, in this case in 1930, we are wrong. We are incorporating this protection against double jeopardy to include state governments as well. So it took until 1968 for your double jeopardy protections to get incorporated to include limitations on the state government. Too late for Mr. Palco, obviously, unfortunately, but it just kind of shows you how long sometimes this incorporation process is taken by the Supreme Court. You have a protection against self-incrimination in the Fifth Amendment as well, and you may not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and your property cannot be taken without compensation. So this allows you to have due process of law before you lose any life, liberty, or property. Sixth Amendment, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. Now, if you know how our criminal justice process works today, I think you can probably make an argument that a lot of our trials are not necessarily speedy, but you have a right to a speedy and public trial. You have a right to an impartial jury to hear your case. You have a right to be informed of the nature and cause of accusations. You have the right to confront witnesses that are being brought against you. You have the right to obtain witnesses in your favor, and you have the right to have assistance of counsel. Very famous case in the 1960s, Miranda versus Arizona, where it then incorporated this right to include state and local governments. So now state and local police have to inform you of your Miranda rights. That's what they're called, Miranda rights, because it's from a case called Miranda versus Arizona. So they have to inform you. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to counsel. If you cannot afford counsel, one will be appointed to you. That's providing you with your Fifth and your Sixth Amendment rights. So again, a slow process in incorporating a lot of these rights. Seventh Amendment gives you the right to a jury trial in a civil case where the value is more than $20. So it kind of dates the Constitution a little bit. $20 will maybe get you an extra value meal at McDonald's, and that's about it today. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail should not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. This was the debate that we were having in the cases of Furman as well as Gregg versus Georgia in terms of the death penalty. Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others by the people. Again, we've enumerated certain rights to the national government, but that's not to say that the other rights do not still reside with the people. And then the 10th Amendment, power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Again, the 9th and the 10th Amendment were provided specifically to try and mitigate the concerns of the anti-federalists that the national government would become too strong as a result of the rights provided to the national government in the Constitution. 11th Amendment limits the judicial power of the United States. 12th Amendment changes the way in which we elect presidents and vice presidents. If you're familiar with, if you saw Hamilton, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but the election of 1800, where Jefferson came in first and Aaron Burr came in second. And in a situation like that, the president is the person who comes in first, and the person who comes in second becomes their vice president. Jefferson and Burr hated each other with a passion. Jefferson later on actually tried to get Burr executed under charges of treason. That's how much they hated each other. So Jefferson very quickly moved to try and change that system so that you no longer have a situation where the person who comes in second becomes vice president. We get that in our 12th Amendment. 13th Amendment obviously outlaws slavery. We had that in 1865. 14th Amendment is known as the Equal Protection Amendment. So the Equal Protection Amendment was intended to try and extend these protections that initially only applied to the national government to include state governments as well. But it really took the combination of not just the 14th Amendment, but it also took the combination of Supreme Court interpretation for us to really get to that point of incorporation. And several of these rights that you would think would normally have been automatically incorporated because of the 14th Amendment equal protection actually took some time before the Supreme Court actually incorporated them. 15th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment gives us the direct income tax. Under the original Constitution, Congress had the power to tax, but that taxation had to be apportioned according to state population. So if someone tells you the federal income tax is unconstitutional, they're right under the original Constitution, but they're not right anymore because of the 16th Amendment. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment. What the 16th Amendment has done is it's made it easier for Congress not only to levy a direct federal income tax, but it's also made it easier for Congress to limit the tax-exempt nature of municipal debts. And I don't want to get too much into it. We'll talk more about that topic when we get to the Spraja article a little bit later on. But essentially what the Congress has done is the Congress has really limited the ability of state and local governments to issue debt where interest earned by investors is exempt from taxation. Being able to issue tax-exempt debt really gives governments a leg up whenever their debt has to compete with corporate debt. But Congress really has limited their ability to issue that type of tax-exempt debt. And one of the reasons why they've been able to do that is this 16th Amendment, that Congress can lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment. Very broad grant of taxing powers to the Congress. 17th Amendment is where we call for the direct election of senators. And so whereby under the original Constitution, they were selected by state legislatures. Now in 1913, we now have the direct election of senators. And so it took a long time. It took well over 100 years before we ended up getting to the direct election of US senators. 18th Amendment was prohibition. And again, that is a preemptive measure on the part of the national government to take away the ability of states to have legal alcohol distribution. So that's a very strong proclamation of national power. The 19th Amendment is women's suffrage, and that was ratified in 1920. Many states were way out in front of that. States like Oregon and Wyoming actually had approved women's suffrage as far back as 1868, but it took many, many years for this to become part of the Constitution at the federal level. The 20th Amendment changes the terms of presidents and members of Congress, moving their terms up from March until January to begin in January to try and have less time between the election and when they take office. 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. 22nd Amendment places a two-term limit on presidents. And that was in response to FDR, who had won 4 elections for president. And so we wanted to limit that. So we only had a two-term limitation for presidents. 23rd Amendment provides 3 electoral college votes to the District of Columbia. So instead of having 535 electoral votes in the electoral college, we now have 538. 24th Amendment has direct impact upon federal-state relations as well. This outlaws the poll tax. As we know, a lot of southern states were using the poll tax to try and deprive people of their right to vote. 24th Amendment makes poll taxes unconstitutional, does what we call preemption. This is the national government preempting the law-making ability of state governments. The 25th Amendment changes the presidential succession process. If a president becomes disabled in office, it provides for a process by which the vice president and a majority of the cabinet or a committee as determined by Congress can declare the president unable to carry out their duties, and then the vice president would then immediately take over the duties of the president until the president is able to essentially convince Congress that they are once again able to carry out their duties. And so it just kind of gives us a process in case the president is disabled and unable to carry out their duties. 26th Amendment expands suffrage to include 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then finally, the 27th Amendment, this is what was originally supposed to be the First Amendment to the Constitution, but did not get ratified at that time. No law varying compensation for services of senators or representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. So you cannot raise your pay as Congress until you stand for re-election. Originally authored by James Madison back in 1789, not officially ratified until 1992. And the reason why this amendment was able to be ratified over 200 years after it was originally authored is that back when the first 12 amendments to the Constitution were proposed, they didn't have what we call sunset provisions. Amendments to the Constitution today, when they are proposed by the House and the Senate, will have a sunset provision that says if the requisite number of state legislatures do not ratify this amendment by this date, usually 7 years, then the amendment becomes null and void. Well, back then we didn't have that sunset provision. So there's a student in Texas who wrote a term paper making the argument that this amendment was still a viable amendment, and that if it got the requisite 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify it, it could become part of the Constitution. His professor didn't really believe him, and I think gave him a C or a C- on his paper. Undeterred, he went out there and started a national movement to get the remaining states to ratify the amendment. That happened on May 7th, 1992, and what was originally going to be the First Amendment to the Constitution ended up becoming the 27th Amendment to the Constitution 200 years later. So it's kind of a really interesting type of civics lesson in an amendment that was written by James Madison and didn't actually become part of the Constitution until the 1990s. But again, the Constitution is obviously the most important document that we go back to and serves as our touchstone for understanding the relationship between national and state governments. Local governments, as you've noticed by your reading of the Constitution, are not included in the Constitution. Only national and state governments are included, but it does give us that framework for understanding how the two levels of government interact with each other, their roles and their responsibilities. But as we had said, it is a series of compromises, and so its interpretation is very much dynamic and depends upon the Supreme Court. And so that's why I took you through all those cases to kind of show you how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution from a federalism perspective over the past 200 years. If you haven't had an opportunity to at least peruse the Constitution, I do recommend that you do it. I mean, I think every American needs to read the Constitution at least once. I would hope that our elected officials actually read the Constitution too. We used to have some elected officials who used to carry a copy of the Constitution with them in their suit pocket or with them at all times. Those senators and representatives are no longer in Congress, and so I don't know how many members actually read the Constitution on a frequent basis, but it's there for you to read through to, again, serve as the touchstone for understanding how our different levels of government interact in our system of federalism. Questions on any of this information? I know we've covered a lot of ground tonight, but I really like to spend this first session kind of giving you the foundational understanding of American federalism so that you can then take that understanding and then better understand the articles that we read throughout the rest of the course. So any questions? Okay, I'm just kind of beating you. This is the night that I talk a lot. This is the last night that I'm going to talk a lot. All of our future sessions, you will be leading discussions on articles. And so for the folks who are up next week, let me see if I don't know if I have the, let me see if I've got the spreadsheet ready here. Okay, I actually do. Let me share the spreadsheet with you. And again, this has not been updated since class began. So if you send me an email signing up for an article, I haven't added that yet. But tonight we did articles in Confederation and Constitution, so that is taken care of. Then next week we have Federalist number 39, Federalist number 10. Then we have the article by Morton Grodson's The Federal System, Miles of State and Local, National State and Local Relationships by D.L. Wright, and then The Paradox of the Middle Tier by Martha Durthick. So we essentially have 5 readings, if I counted correctly, that we are going to be doing next week. The way the discussion leader assignments will work is I'm really looking at this being a discussion. So it's not really a presentation. If you'd like to use PowerPoint slide, I can certainly allow screen sharing for you as you go through your discussion. You are not required to do that. But what you are doing is you are leading a 20 to 30-minute discussion on your article. So you'll be asking questions to the class about, what the author said, and then maybe bringing in some more contemporary examples because a lot of these articles are classics, and so they're a little bit older. So it's always interesting to see how times have changed, perhaps the author's interpretation of different things they've written about in the article. About a 20 to 30-minute discussion that you'll be leading on your article. Then when you are done with your discussion, then I will chime in and I will then add my perspective in terms of what I think about the article and kind of help create a context for understanding the article. So I won't be silent, but I'll wait until your discussion is over and then I'll chime in for about 5 or 10 minutes to kind of create that frame of reference and kind of create that context. So that's what we're going to be doing from now on. You'll see that the vast majority of articles are already signed up for. There are a few that are available. So if you haven't signed up yet, please send me that email and we'll get you signed up. But I won't be doing a whole lot of lecturing. I will be letting you lead the discussion and then just jumping in here and there to kind of help the discussion flow. All right?
All right, Professor, quick question just to confirm the articles are available on Canvas?
They're either in the O'Toole textbook or they're available on Canvas. The ones that aren't in O'Toole are available on Canvas.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Dr. Paul, I have a question. The article critique 1 and article critique 2. I wasn't here Saturday. What exactly are we focused on, or did you want to explain it offline later?
I'll explain it again. It's we're looking at very short, they're usually about 5 to 7 page critiques, and the critique should consist of 3 parts. The first part of the critique should be just your description of the article. So what was the author saying? What were the author's main points? So just a really brief description. The second part of the critique is what I'm most interested in. That's your analysis of the article. So what did you think about the author's argument? Did the author leave out some important points? Are there different ways that you have approached the topic as compared to the author? So I really do want you to take a very critical approach to the argument that the author's making. Second part of the critique. Then the third part of the critique is the application of the article to public administration and federalism. So are there any aspects of the article that would help you in terms of your job on a daily basis that could be helpful for your organization? So those are the three parts of the critique. Again, they're usually about 5 to 7 pages. And I do ask that you incorporate some outside research as well. So maybe 2 or 3 or 4 outside sources that help you analyze and critique the article.
Okay, and the articles are they the readings or
Yeah.
where would we? Okay, so apart from the one that we're going to be a leader in the discussion, we pick two separate ones that we will analyze.
Yeah, I actually think on Saturday I said you can use the same one. And so
Oh, okay.
we get discussion on, you could do an article critique on that one as well. Just save
Oh,
yourself a
okay.
little bit of time. But yes, the articles are all the articles from the O'Toole textbook. You can select an article from O'Toole or the articles I've provided on our Canvas site. So any of the articles on this spreadsheet, they're fair game to write an article critique on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
My pleasure. And just remember, they need to be turned in before we discuss the article in class. And so I think the schedule is probably going to hold pretty closely. We'll see. We only have 4 articles scheduled on December 20th. So we might have to play around with that a little bit, maybe move an article from the January 10th into December 20th. But we'll play with that a little bit later on. We'll see how we proceed with that. But yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all the articles by the 24th. If not, then we can certainly finish up any articles we can't get to on the 24th in our Saturday session on the 27th. But again, your discussion leader is about 20-30 minute discussion that you're going to be leading. Then your article critique about 5 to 7 pages. Certainly will get the job done.
Professor, could you clarify? You said to turn it in before the discussion. Could you clarify what that means?
Sure. Yeah. So if you, for instance, you want to do next week, we have Federal System by Morton Grodzins. If that's an article that you want to write a critique on, you would have to turn that in before class on the 13th. So anytime before 6 o'clock on the 13th, you would have to turn your critique in, because I really want to see your thinking in the critique rather than what we talked about in class.
Okay. And then quick follow-up, is there, I know you explained like the outline, but is there kind of like a grading breakdown or like a rubric of, how you'll be grading the assignments?
Yeah, I'm going to grade them. Each of the 3 parts will be weighted equally at 30% for each of the main 3 parts. And then there's a 10% quality of writing component, which just means to make sure you proofread, make sure that there aren't a lot of typographical errors. I do ask when you cite your articles that you're using as your references, do use APA formats. I'm not going to ding you very, very much in terms of if you miss something in APA, but do use APA format for all of your citations. But what I'm really, even though I'm weighting all 3 parts of it equally, what I'm really, really interested in is that second part, is your critique, your analysis. And so for the most part, people do really well on the description of the article. They usually do really well on the third part, the application. And where you really want to focus your attention is on your critique of the author's argument, because that's really what I'm going to dig into and really expect that you do challenge the author and challenge some of the arguments that the author makes. I really want to see, what I'm looking for is critical thinking and critical analysis. And it's true that the authors of these articles, they're for the most part, they're really respected authors, or they all are respected authors in the field of federalism, but it doesn't mean that you can't challenge their thinking. There could very well be some things that they should have talked about that they didn't. Or another good way to critique is to update the article. If you've got an article from 1986, a lot has happened in federalism since 1986. So how do modern events and modern topics affect what the author's argument was? Maybe something has happened over the past 20 years that would completely change the way in which the author would have attacked the article. So, think about updating a lot of these articles that are a little bit older. Now, the ones that are on Canvas, those are much more recent articles. And so they're from, 2020, 2021, 2022. So there's not a whole lot of updating to those to be done. But some of the old classic ones in the O'Toole textbook, you can really update those in that second part of the critique. Good questions. Anything else before I let you go for the evening?
Professor, can you confirm how long you want these critiques to be? How many pages?
Yeah, 5 to 7 is what they usually are, but they can be a little shorter, a little longer. I'm not going to stop reading at 7 pages. So, but in the past, they're about 5 to 7. But a lot of it depends upon the article that you are critiquing. Some of the articles are pretty descriptive. And so, when you're describing the article, there's not a whole lot to describe because they're really kind of straightforward. Some of the other articles, think about like the Entrepreneurial Cities articles, one of my favorite articles by Alberto Spraja. That is a very in-depth layered article. And Spraja makes a lot of arguments kind of layered on top of each other. So if you're critiquing the Spraja article, there's a lot more to delve into. And so sometimes you'll be on more on the 7-page end of the spectrum. Another one, the Agranoff article, another look at bargaining. It's a relatively long and kind of in-depth article, which is probably going to take you about 7 pages or so to get through. One that is not that in-depth, the Economics of Intergovernmental Grants by George Brake. That essentially just lays out for us different types of grants and tells us what the different types of grants are. So there's probably a little bit less to chew on with that article. So sometimes those critiques tend to be a little shorter. So it will depend upon the article you're critiquing. But I think 5 to 7 is a good rule of thumb.
Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Okay,
Professor,
oh yeah, go ahead.
sorry, one more question.
Mhm.
Do you know what the file is titled under Canva for the articles? I'm having a hard time finding them.
Yeah, they should all be at the bottom module. Let me see if I can get in there now. Can you see the Canvas site?
Yes.
Okay, oh good. It worked. If we go under modules,
Oh, on the screen, I don't see it on the screen.
Oh, on the screen? No, I'm sorry. I
Okay,
have it up
okay.
on my
All
my
right.
end.
let me share it this way then. I think I may have to do it like this. Okay, give it a second.
There it goes.
Okay, there it is. All right. If you go under modules down here at the bottom, here are all those additional articles that are not part of the O'Toole textbook. So I included them down here.
Okay, so those are the only ones that are on Canva.
Yes, I'm going to add another State of American Federalism one on there as well. I haven't done that yet, but yeah, those are the ones that are not in the O'Toole textbook. The other ones should all be then in O'Toole.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure. Anything else?
Oh, just quick question. So the O'Toole textbook, it's like a collection of all the articles?
Yes. Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah, what he does, it's a collection of the articles, and then he divides them up like we've divided our modules. So he'll have one section on, foundations, one section on political aspects. Here's another section of articles on fiscal federalism, another one on administrative aspects of federalism, and then another section on future emerging trends. So the same type of modules that we use, that's how his textbook is split up. And so what he'll do is he'll give you like a 4 or 5 page introduction, and then you'll have 3, 4, or 5 articles on the topic. Then another chapter with 3 or 4 page introduction, and then 4 or 5 articles on the topic. But yeah, it's essentially just a collection of those articles.
all right. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you very much for being here. I'll get this recording up onto our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning that you can review it. And hope everyone has a good remainder of the week. And then again, for next week, if you've signed up for one of those articles, then you'll be laying your discussion then for next week. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Have a good
All
week.
right, thank you, Dr. Paul. Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Thanks, Dr.
Talk
Powell.
to you
Have a good
soon.
night.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Oh, Dr. Powell, sorry, did you leave it? Oh.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, sorry. Just one last question. If I'm